The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the cracked asphalt of Route 47 into a mirror of gray clouds and dying light. Maya Chen gripped the steering wheel of her Honda with both hands, her knuckles pale against the worn leather. The windshield wipers beat a rhythmic protest against the downpour, their metronome urgency doing little to clear her vision or her mind. She'd been driving for 3 hours straight from Boston, chasing a story that most people had long forgotten, pursuing ghosts that her editor had warned her were better left alone. But Maya had never been good at leaving things alone. It was what made her a talented investigative journalist, and what had cost her nearly everything else. The GPS on her phone flickered, its robotic voice cutting through the sound of rain. In 500 feet, turn right onto Holloway Road. Maya leaned forward, squinting through the deluge. There, barely visible through the curtain of water, stood a rusted street sign, its letters so faded she could barely make out the name. She turned, and the paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt that had become mud under the relentless storm. The trees closed in on both sides, their bare branches reaching across the road like skeletal fingers trying to weave themselves back together. This deep into rural Massachusetts, autumn had already stripped the landscape to its bones. Maya felt her heart rate pick up, that familiar cocktail of anticipation and unease that always preceded her best work. She'd felt it before breaking the story about the pharmaceutical company that had buried evidence of fatal side effects. She'd felt it when she'd exposed the nursing home chain systematically defrauding elderly patients. And she felt it now, driving toward a place that had been abandoned for 43 years. Holloway State Hospital loomed into view like something from a fever dream. The building rose 4 stories high, its red brick facade darkened by decades of rain and neglect. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and sections of the roof had collapsed inward, creating jagged silhouettes against the storm-dark sky. Ivy had conquered the eastern wall entirely, its tendrils worming through cracks in the masonry, pulling the structure slowly back toward the earth. A rusted fence surrounded the property, topped with barbed wire that had long ago lost its intimidating edge, now sagging and broken in places where vandals and urban explorers had carved their passages. Maya parked her car near what had once been the main entrance, a grand archway now choked with debris and weather-worn planks that someone had nailed across the doorway years ago. She sat for a moment, engine running, watching the rain stream down her windshield. The building seemed to breathe in the storm, expanding and contracting with each gust of wind, settling deeper into its own decay. She thought about calling her sister, Rachel, just to let someone know where she was. But Rachel would only worry, would only ask again why Maya couldn't just let the past be past, why she had to keep digging into other people's tragedies. "You're trying to fix something that can't be fixed?" Rachel had told her 3 months ago, when Maya had shown up at her door after another sleepless week of research. "Mom's gone. What happened to her wasn't your fault. You need to stop punishing yourself." But this wasn't about punishment. This was about the truth. This was about the hundreds of people who had lived and died within these walls, their stories reduced to scattered records and bureaucratic footnotes. This was about the woman whose journal Maya had discovered in a box of estate sale documents, a nurse named Ellen Hartley who had worked at Holloway from 1968 until its closure in 1982, and whose meticulous notes had hinted at something far darker than the official narrative of administrative restructuring and budget cuts. Maya turned off the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional crack of thunder rolling across the hills. She reached into the passenger seat for her backpack, checking its contents one more time. Flashlight, extra batteries, digital recorder, camera, water bottle, energy bars, first aid kit, phone charger, and the photocopied pages of Ellen Hartley's journal. Everything she needed for what she'd told herself would be just a preliminary survey, a quick look around before she came back with proper equipment and maybe someone from the State Historical Society. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. She wouldn't be back. Whatever story lived inside Holloway State Hospital, she would find it tonight. Before I continue with what Maya found inside those walls, if you're finding this investigation compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. This story gets much darker, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The rain soaked through her jacket within seconds of stepping out of the car. Maya pulled her hood up and shouldered her backpack, making her way toward the eastern side of the building where Ellen's journal had mentioned a service entrance. The ground squelched beneath her boots, mud mixing with decades of fallen leaves and the detritus of abandonment. Broken glass, rusted cans, fragments of furniture that had been thrown from upper windows. She found the service entrance exactly where the journal had indicated, a metal door set into the brick, its paint long since peeled away to reveal rust-eaten steel beneath. Someone had pried it open years ago. It hung crooked on one hinge, creating a gap just wide enough to slip through. Maya pulled her flashlight from her backpack and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness beyond the doorway. The smell hit her first. Damp concrete and mildew, mixed with something sweeter and more organic. The smell of rot, of nature reclaiming what humanity had abandoned. She stepped inside, and the sound of the rain immediately became muted, replaced by the steady drip of water leaking through the compromised roof and the creak of the building settling around her. The service corridor stretched ahead, its walls covered in peeling paint that had once been institutional green. Gurneys lined one side, their wheels rusted into immobility, their thin mattresses disintegrated into springs and foam. Doors hung open along the hallway, revealing rooms filled with debris, overturned filing cabinets, scattered papers that had become pulp in the damp, chairs with their stuffing exposed and colonized by mold. Maya moved slowly, documenting everything with her camera. She'd learned early in her career that you never knew which detail would matter, which small piece of evidence would unlock a larger truth. She photographed the faded signs on the walls: administration, laundry, medical records. She photographed the graffiti that urban explorers had left behind, their spray-painted declarations of "Kilroy was here" and "abandon hope," seeming both cliché and oddly appropriate. At the end of the corridor, she found a stairwell. The steps were concrete, less damaged than the wooden floors of the hallway, and they spiraled upward into darkness. According to Ellen's journal, the patient wards had been on the second and third floors, with the fourth floor reserved for what the hospital had euphemistically called intensive treatment. Maya started climbing. The second floor landing opened onto a wider hallway, this one lined with numbered doors. Patient rooms. Maya's flashlight beam swept across them, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. Each door had a small observation window, most of them now just empty frames where glass had once been. She approached the first room and peered inside. A metal bed frame, stripped of its mattress. A toilet in the corner, cracked and stained. Walls covered in scratches, some forming patterns that might have been words, might have been the desperate scrabbling of someone trying to claw their way out of their own mind. Maya raised her camera, but her hands were shaking slightly, making it hard to frame the shot properly. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded small and intrusive in the vast silence of the building. She moved down the hallway, checking each room. They were all variations on the same theme: stripped, damaged, haunted by the absence of the people who had once occupied them. In one room, she found a child's drawing still pinned to the wall, so faded she could barely make out the stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow circle that might have been the sun. In another, someone had written in what looked like crayon, the words barely legible: "I want to go home. Please let me go home. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." She pushed away thoughts of her mother's final years and continued down the hall. At the far end, she found what Ellen's journal had called the day room, a larger space where patients had been allowed to gather for supervised recreation. The windows here were tall, offering a view of the darkening landscape beyond, and even in decay, the room held a strange grandeur. A piano stood in one corner, its keys yellowed and several missing, its inner workings exposed where the lid had been pried off. Chairs and small tables were scattered across the floor, some overturned, some still arranged in neat circles as if waiting for patients who would never return. Maya walked to the center of the room and stood still, trying to imagine what it had been like when this place was full of life. She pictured nurses in their crisp white uniforms, doctors making their rounds, patients moving through their carefully structured days. She tried to hear the echoes of conversation, the notes of the piano, the shuffle of feet on linoleum. Instead, She heard only the rain and the building's slow collapse. She was about to return to the stairwell when her flashlight beam caught something on the wall near the piano. She moved closer, her heart suddenly beating faster. It was a bulletin board, its cork surface warped and water-damaged, but still holding a few pinned papers. Most were too deteriorated to read, but one caught her attention. A schedule from October 1979, listing daily activities: 8 a.m., breakfast; 9 a.m., morning medication; 10 a.m., occupational therapy; 12 p.m., lunch. The mundane routine of institutionalized life, preserved in fading ink. And beneath the schedule, partially obscured by a water stain, was a photograph. Maya carefully unpinned it, her hands gentle despite her excitement. The photo showed a group of people, staff and patients she assumed, standing in this very room, positioned in front of the piano. They were smiling, at least most of them were, that forced smile people give to cameras when someone tells them to say cheese. But one face in the back row caught her attention immediately. A young woman, no more than 25, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was both beautiful and profoundly sad. She wasn't smiling. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that made Maya's chest ache. An expression of such pure, concentrated grief that it seemed to transcend the photograph, to reach across 40-some years and speak directly to her. Maya turned the photo over. Written in pencil on the back, in what she recognized from the photocopies as Ellen Hartley's handwriting, were 4 words: "Sarah, please forgive me." Thunder cracked overhead, so loud that Maya flinched. The building groaned around her, settling deeper into its foundation. She slipped the photograph carefully into her jacket pocket and pulled out Ellen's journal, flipping to the entries from late 1979. There, scattered among routine observations about medication schedules and behavioral incidents, were references to a patient named Sarah. Always just Sarah, never a last name, never more than a line or 2. Sarah refused her dinner again. Sarah spoke today, but only to ask about letters. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." And then, in an entry from November 15, 1979, Ellen had written something longer, something that had made Maya book this trip the moment she'd first read it. "What we did to Sarah was unforgivable. Dr. Meridian says I need to stop being emotional about this, that she was just one patient, that the treatment plan was approved by the board, but I can't sleep anymore. I can't stop hearing her screaming. I couldn't stop seeing her face when she finally understood that no one was coming for her. If there's hell, we've earned our place there. All of us." Maya looked at the photograph again, at Sarah's face, and felt the familiar pull of a story demanding to be told. Who was this woman? What had been done to her? And why, after all these years, did Ellen Hartley's guilt still echo in these walls? She needed to find Sarah's file. If it still existed, it would be in the medical records room, which, according to the hospital floor plan Ellen had sketched in her journal, was on the first floor in the administrative wing. Maya made her way back to the stairwell, her flashlight beam dancing across walls and floors, her mind already constructing the narrative, already imagining the article she would write. The first floor was in worse condition than the second, the ceiling in several places having given way entirely, allowing rain to pour in and pool on the floor. Maya picked her way carefully around the debris, following Ellen's map in her mind. The administrative wing branched off to the west, and she found it after only one wrong turn that led her into what had been the hospital's kitchen. A vast room filled with industrial stoves and refrigerators, all of them rusted into abstract sculptures. The medical records room door was locked, but the wood around the handle was so rotted that it gave way when Maya leaned her weight against it. She stumbled inside, catching herself on a filing cabinet that immediately tipped forward, nearly crushing her before she managed to jump back. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she steadied herself, breathing hard. The room was lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets. Maya worked methodically through the drawers until she found what she needed. A folder thicker than the others, filed under M. Patient name: Sarah Margaret Whitmore. Admitted: March 17, 1974. Age at admission: 19. Maya's hands trembled as she pulled out the file and began to read. And as she read, standing in that ruined room with rain pouring through gaps in the ceiling, She began to understand why Ellen Hartley had carried her guilt to the grave, why this place held such sorrow in its bones. Sarah's story was about to be told, and Maya knew with absolute certainty that it would break her heart. Maya sat down on an overturned filing cabinet, the metal cold and damp beneath her, and began to read Sarah's file by flashlight. The first page was an intake form, filled out in the precise handwriting of a hospital administrator who had reduced a young woman's entire existence to checkboxes and clinical observations. Patient presented with acute distress. Non-communicative. Appears disoriented and confused. No known family contact. Referred by County Social Services following the incident at St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers. Maya's stomach tightened. She flipped to the next page. A psychiatric evaluation dated March 19, 1974, 2 days after Sarah's admission. The evaluating physician was a Dr. Richard Meridian, the same name Ellen had mentioned in her journal entry. His assessment was cold, detached, the kind of clinical language that stripped away humanity in favor of diagnosis. The patient exhibits symptoms consistent with postpartum psychosis, complicated by unresolved trauma and possible underlying schizophrenic tendencies. Recommend immediate pharmaceutical intervention and observation for risk of self-harm or harm to others. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom of the evaluation that made Maya's hands shake. In a smaller, almost apologetic script, someone, possibly a nurse, possibly Ellen herself, had added, "Patient keeps asking for her baby. Says she can hear him crying. Won't believe us when we tell her the baby was stillborn. Sedation recommended to calm acute distress." Maya closed her eyes, the weight of those words settling over her like a physical thing. A 19-year-old girl, alone, grieving, probably terrified, locked away and told her baby was dead. Whether it was true or not, the cruelty of the situation was staggering. She thought of her own mother again, thought of the way grief could hollow a person out, leave them barely recognizable. She continued reading, page after page of medical notes that painted a picture of Sarah's first months at Holloway. The pharmaceutical intervention had been aggressive, antipsychotics, sedatives, mood stabilizers, all in doses that seemed excessive even by 1970 standards. Sarah had responded poorly, becoming withdrawn, refusing to eat, spending hours staring at the wall or pacing her room until the staff sedated her again. There were incident reports documenting her attempts to escape. 5 times in the first 2 months, she tried to leave, once managing to make it as far as the front gates before orderlies caught her and brought her back. Each escape attempt had resulted in increased security measures and higher doses of medication. By June 1974, the notes indicated that Sarah had stopped trying to run. She'd stopped talking entirely, responding to questions with silence or single-word answers. Maya found a photograph tucked between 2 medical reports, a clinical shot taken for hospital records. Sarah stood against a white wall, her dark hair limp around her face, her eyes vacant and unfocused. She wore a hospital gown that hung loose on her frame, and her arms, visible in the short sleeves, were marked with bruises. Whether from restraints or self-harm, the photo didn't clarify. The young woman in this picture bore little resemblance to the Sarah in the group photo Maya had found upstairs, despite being taken only months apart. It was as if the institution had already begun to erase her. The file grew thicker as months turned into years. Sarah became a permanent resident of Holloway State Hospital, a fixture in the landscape of the institutionalized. The notes became more sporadic, less detailed, the kind of maintenance documentation that suggested routine rather than active treatment. Patient remains stable on the current medication regimen. No incidents to report. Continues to demonstrate flat effect and minimal engagement with therapeutic activities. But then, in late 1976, something changed. Maya found a series of notes from a new social worker, a woman named Patricia Flores, who seemed to have taken an interest in Sarah's case. Patricia's notes had a different quality to them, more observant, more humane, questioning rather than simply documenting. Reviewed the patient's file in detail today, Patricia had written in October 1976, "I'm troubled by the lack of family contact. The patient was admitted via social services, but there's no record of any attempt to locate next of kin. The patient was 19 at admission, Legally an adult, yes, but where are her parents? Why was she at a home for unwed mothers? What happened to the baby? I've requested permission to investigate the patient's background, to see if there's a family who might be located. Dr. Meridian was resistant to the idea, citing patient stability and the risk of psychological disruption. But I believe Sarah deserves the chance to reconnect with any family she might have. Maya felt a surge of gratitude for this woman she'd never met, this Patricia Flores who had seen Sarah as more than just a case file. She flipped ahead, eager to see what the social worker had discovered, and found a series of notes documenting Patricia's investigation. It had taken her 3 months, but Patricia had located Sarah's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, living in a small town in Vermont, widowed, working as a seamstress. Patricia's notes from the initial phone contact were heartbreaking in their restraint. Spoke with Mrs. Whitmore today. She was shocked to learn her daughter was alive. She believed Sarah had died in 1973. When I asked her to clarify, she became very emotional and said she needed time to process this information. She promised to call back within a week. Eleanor Whitmore had believed her daughter was dead. Maya read that line 3 times, trying to understand what could have led a mother to believe such a thing. She read on, and the story began to emerge in fragments, pieced together from Patricia's careful notes and a letter Eleanor had eventually sent to the hospital. Sarah had gotten pregnant at 18, the result of a relationship with a young man who had left town the moment he learned about the baby. Eleanor, a devout Catholic struggling with her own grief over her husband's recent death, had been devastated and ashamed. She'd sent Sarah to St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers, a facility run by nuns who specialized in caring for pregnant girls and arranging adoptions for their babies. It was supposed to be temporary. Sarah would have the baby, give it up for adoption, and return home to rebuild her life. That was the plan. But according to Eleanor's letter, she had received a phone call from St. Mary's in March 1974, informing her that there had been complications during delivery. The baby had been stillborn, and Sarah, overcome with grief and guilt, had taken her own life the following day. Eleanor had buried an empty casket. She'd mourned her daughter for 3 years, carrying the weight of their last argument, the harsh words she'd spoken when she'd sent Sarah away. And now Patricia Flores was telling her that it had all been a lie, that Sarah was alive, that she'd been institutionalized this entire time. Maya's hands clenched around the file. Someone at St. Mary's had lied. They'd told Eleanor that Sarah was dead, and they'd had Sarah committed to Holloway, presumably to cover up whatever had actually happened. Had the baby really been stillborn? Or had Sarah's refusal to give up her child, her insistence that she could hear him crying, been the truth rather than delusion? Patricia's notes documented the painful process of reunion. Eleanor had come to Holloway in February 1977, 4 years after she'd said goodbye to her daughter. The meeting had been supervised, with Dr. Meridian present, and according to Patricia's observations, it had been devastating for both women. Sarah hadn't recognized her mother at first. The medications and the years of institutionalization had left her disconnected, struggling to grasp the reality being presented to her. Eleanor had wept, had tried to embrace her daughter, but Sarah had flinched away, confused and frightened by the stranger's emotion. Dr. Meridian recommended limiting contact. Patricia had written, her frustration evident in the sharp strokes of her pen. He believes that reintroducing family connections at this stage could destabilize a patient's fragile equilibrium. I strongly disagree. Sarah's isolation has been part of her illness, not a treatment for it. Mrs. Whitmore wants to take her daughter home, and I believe with proper outpatient care, Sarah could recover significantly outside this institutional environment. What followed was a bureaucratic battle documented in memos and formal letters. Eleanor wanted Sarah released to her care. Patricia supported this plan and had begun working on discharge arrangements. But Dr. Meridian had opposed it, arguing that Sarah was too unstable, too dependent on the structured environment of Holloway, that releasing her would be dangerous for both Sarah and her mother. Maya could read between the lines of the increasingly terse correspondence. This wasn't about Sarah's well-being. This was about power, about a doctor who didn't want his authority questioned, about an institution that needed to maintain its patient population to justify its funding. Patricia had fought hard, had escalated the matter to the hospital board, but in the end, institutional inertia had won. The final note from Patricia Flores was dated August 1977. I've been informed that my position is being eliminated due to budget restructuring. My last day will be August 31st. I've tried to ensure Sarah's case is transferred to my replacement, but I've been told the hospital is not hiring a new social worker at this time. I feel I'm abandoning her, and it's breaking my heart. Mrs. Whitmore calls every week, begging for updates, asking when she can visit again. I have no good answers to give her. I don't know what will happen to Sarah now. Maya wiped her eyes and continued reading. Patricia had been Sarah's advocate, maybe her only real advocate, and she'd been pushed out for doing her job too well, for caring too much. The file continued, but the notes became sparse again. Eleanor had kept trying to visit, but the records showed that Dr. Meridian had implemented new restrictions on visitor access, citing patient welfare. By 1978, there were notes indicating that Sarah had become agitated during her mother's visits, though Maya suspected that the agitation had more to do with the brief glimpses of hope that were then snatched away than with any genuine distress at seeing Eleanor. And then Maya found Ellen Hartley's notes. They started in early 1979, when Ellen had apparently been assigned to Sarah's ward. The early entries were professional, detached, but as months passed, Ellen's notes took on a different character. She'd noticed things. Small things that the doctors seemed to miss or ignore. Sarah's medication seems excessive. Ellen had written in April 1979. She's so sedated that she can barely stay awake during the day. When I mentioned this to Dr. Meridian, he said the dosage was necessary to manage her condition, but I wonder if we're managing the symptoms we're creating. She seems more alert in the mornings before her first dose. Today she asked me about her mother. It's the first personal question I've heard her ask in weeks. Ellen had started reducing Sarah's morning medication slightly, giving her a few more hours of clarity each day. It was a small act of rebellion, risky for a nurse who could lose her job for deviating from a doctor's orders, but Ellen had done it anyway, and Sarah had responded. The notes documented Sarah's slow emergence from the fog of overmedication. She'd started talking more, engaging with other patients, even smiling occasionally. Ellen had begun sitting with her during breaks, just talking, treating her like a person rather than a problem to be managed. Sarah had told her story in fragments. About the baby she'd never been allowed to hold, about the mother she'd thought had abandoned her, about the years that had been stolen from her. She's not psychotic, Ellen had written in July 1979. I don't believe she ever was. She was a traumatized teenager who was grieving, and instead of getting help, she was drugged and locked away. I spoke to one of the older nurses today, someone who worked at St. Mary's before coming here. She got uncomfortable when I mentioned Sarah's name, changed the subject quickly. I think there's something she knows, something she's not saying. I need to find out what really happened. Maya's pulse quickened. Ellen had been investigating just as Maya was investigating now, 40-some years later. She turned the page and found a photocopy of a birth certificate, yellowed and barely legible, but unmistakable. Baby boy Whitmore. Born March 15, 1974, at St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers. Mother, Sarah Margaret Whitmore. Father, unknown. Weight, 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Status, live birth. Live birth, not stillborn. Live birth. Maya felt the world tilt around her. The baby had been alive. Sarah had been telling the truth. Her son had been born alive, and someone, the nuns at St. Mary's, Dr. Meridian, someone in the institutional machinery that had swallowed Sarah whole, had lied about it. They'd told Eleanor her grandson was dead. They'd had Sarah committed when she'd refused to accept the lie. And then they drugged her into submission, kept her isolated, and destroyed any chance she had of proving the truth. Where was the baby now? Adopted, presumably, given to some couple who'd been told his mother was dead or had willingly given him up. He'd be 11 years old by 1979, growing up somewhere with no idea that his real mother was locked in an asylum, declared insane for the crime of knowing he existed. Ellen's notes continued, growing more urgent. She'd confronted Dr. Meridian with the birth certificate, demanding to know why Sarah's file listed the baby as stillborn when the official record showed otherwise. The confrontation had not gone well. Dr. Meridian was furious, Ellen had written. He said I was overstepping my authority, that I didn't understand the complexity of the case, that there were legal and ethical considerations I wasn't qualified to assess. He said the adoption had been finalized, that the child was in a good home, and that reopening this matter would only cause harm to everyone involved. When I said Sarah had a right to know the truth, he told me that my job was to care for patients, not to question medical decisions made by qualified physicians. I'm being removed from Sarah's ward tomorrow, reassigned to the 4th floor. The 4th floor. Maya remembered Ellen's journal description of the 4th floor as the place for intensive treatment. It was where they sent the most difficult cases, the patients who were deemed too dangerous or too disruptive for the regular wards. It was also reading between the lines of hospital documentation, where people were sent to be broken. And Sarah had been sent there too. Maya found the transfer order dated August 1979. Patient demonstrating increased agitation and resistance to treatment, expressing delusional beliefs about deceased infant, becoming confrontational with staff. Transfer to 4th floor intensive care unit approved for patient safety and welfare. They'd punished her for knowing the truth. They'd taken away the one nurse who'd treated her like a human being, and then they'd sent her to the 4th floor to be silenced. The file went thin after that. Just monthly check-ins noting that Sarah remained in intensive care, that her condition was unchanged, that she continued to require significant pharmaceutical management. Ellen's notes disappeared entirely. She'd been removed from Sarah's care, probably forbidden from documenting anything about her. But Maya remembered the journal entry that had brought her here. November 15, 1979. What we did to Sarah was unforgivable. What had happened on the 4th floor? What had finally broken Ellen's professional silence and driven her to write those words? Maya looked at her watch. It was nearly 9 o'clock. She'd been reading for over an hour, sitting in this cold, damp room, piecing together a tragedy that should have been prevented at a dozen different points. She should go back to her car, get warm, and process what she'd learned. But she knew she wouldn't. She couldn't leave now, not when she was this close to understanding. She needed to go to the 4th floor. She needed to find out what had happened to Sarah in those final months before the hospital closed. Ellen's journal had ended abruptly in early 1980. There were no more entries after January, as if Ellen had simply stopped being able to write about what she was witnessing. And Sarah's file had no discharge paperwork, no record of where she'd gone when Holloway closed in 1982. It was as if she'd simply vanished. Maya carefully placed Sarah's file in her backpack, protecting it from the damp. She stood, her legs stiff from sitting, and made her way back through the ruined administrative wing toward the stairwell. The rain had intensified, the sound of it hammering against what remained of the roof almost deafening. Water poured down the stairs, creating a small waterfall that Maya had to carefully navigate. The climb to the 4th floor felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with dread. Maya told herself she was being irrational, that there was nothing up there but more decay, more empty rooms. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, that Sarah's story wasn't finished, that the worst revelation was yet to come. The 4th floor door was heavy, reinforced metal unlike the wooden doors on the lower levels. It stood slightly ajar, wedged open by debris that had fallen from the ceiling. Maya squeezed through the gap and found herself in a hallway unlike the others she'd seen. This floor had been designed differently, with fewer windows and heavier doors on the patient rooms. The walls were covered in padding in some sections, torn and rotting now, but still visible. Restraint equipment hung from walls, leather straps, metal rings, the apparatus of force compliance. This hadn't been a hospital floor. This had been a prison. Maya moved down the hallway, her flashlight revealing horrors that made her stomach turn. Rooms with chairs that had restraints built into the arms. A bath chamber with a metal tub and a complex system of hoses, hydrotherapy, they'd called it, a treatment that involved either scalding or freezing patients into submission. A small room lined entirely with padding. No windows, no furniture, just a drain in the center of the floor. She found Sarah's room at the end of the hall. The door still had a nameplate, though the name had been scratched off. But Maya knew it was hers because the room was different from the others. Someone had covered every inch of the walls with writing, small cramped letters that filled every available space from floor to ceiling. Maya approached slowly, raising her flashlight to read what had been written. It was the same words, repeated over and over in different hands, as if Sarah had written them again and again, a desperate mantra carved into the walls. His name is Michael. He is alive. His name is Michael. He is alive. His name is Michael. He is alive. Thousands of repetitions, maybe tens of thousands, filling the walls, proclaiming a truth that no one had believed, that everyone had tried to medicate and restrain and torture out of her. Michael. She'd given her son a name, and she'd held on to it like a lifeline, had written it into these walls so that even if they erased her, even if they destroyed her completely, some record of him would remain. Maya sank to her knees on the filthy floor, her flashlight beam still illuminating those desperate words. This was why she did this work, to give voice to people like Sarah, to ensure their truth survived even when institutions tried to bury it. Her mother was gone. Rachel was right. No amount of investigative journalism would bring her back, would give Maya the chance to say all the things she'd left unsaid. But maybe, just maybe, she could do something for Sarah. She could tell her story. She could make sure that what happened to her wasn't forgotten and wasn't buried under bureaucracy and institutional indifference. Maya pulled out her camera and began documenting the room, photographing every wall, capturing Sarah's testimony in high resolution. She would publish this story. She would find out what had happened to Sarah after the hospital closed. And if Michael was still alive, if there was any way to find him, she would make sure he knew the truth about his mother. She owed Sarah that much. She owed it to every person who'd been silenced, every truth that had been buried, every voice that had been drowned out by those in power. The storm raged outside, and Maya worked through her tears, bearing witness to a pain that had waited 40 years to be acknowledged. This was why she did this work. Not to run from her own grief, but to honor it by refusing to let anyone else's grief be forgotten. Sarah's story would be told. Maya would make sure of it. Maya spent another hour on the 4th floor, documenting everything she could find. She photographed Sarah's room from every angle, captured close-ups of the writing on the walls, recorded voice memos describing the conditions, the restraint equipment, the evidence of systematic abuse disguised as treatment. The journalist in her knew this was powerful material, the kind of documentation that could expose not just what had happened to Sarah, but the broader failures of the institutional mental health system in the 1970s. But the woman in her, the daughter who'd watched her own mother suffer, who'd felt helpless in the face of illness and loss, that part of her just wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. She was about to leave Sarah's room when her flashlight caught something she'd missed before. In the corner, partially hidden behind where the door would have swung open, was more writing. But this wasn't Sarah's desperate mantra. This was different handwriting, smaller, written in what looked like pencil rather than whatever implement Sarah had used to carve her words into the walls. Maya moved closer, kneeling to read the faded text. It was a date, November 14th, 1979, followed by what appeared to be a letter. Sarah, I don't know if you'll ever see this, or if you'll understand it if you do. They've taken you so far away from yourself that sometimes I'm not sure if there's anything left to reach. But I need to write this down, need to confess what I've been part of, even if the only witness is these walls. Dr. Meridian performed electroconvulsive therapy on you today. ECT, they call it, as if the acronym makes it less brutal. You didn't consent. How could you, when you can barely speak anymore? But he didn't need your consent. You're a ward of the state, and he's the doctor, and that's all the authority required to strap you to a table and send electricity through your brain. I held your hand while they did it. That's all I could do, all I was allowed to do. I held your hand and I whispered that I was sorry, and you looked at me with those eyes that used to be so full of fight and now are just empty. They've stolen everything from you, Sarah. Your baby, your mother, your truth, and now your mind. This is my fault. If I hadn't pushed, if I hadn't confronted Dr. Meridian about Michael, maybe he would have left you alone on the 2nd floor. Maybe you'd still have some quality of life, some small measure of peace. Instead, I made you dangerous to him. I made you someone who knew too much, who might someday be believed if she ever got the chance to speak. I'm quitting. I can't work here anymore. Can't be complicit in this. But quitting won't undo what's been done to you. It won't give you back what you've lost. I'm a coward, Sarah. I'm saving myself and leaving you behind, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. If there's any justice in this world, someone will find this someday. Someone will know what happened to you. Someone will care. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Ellen. Maya's hands shook as she photographed the letter, making sure every word was captured clearly. Ellen had written this the night before her journal entry, the one that had brought Maya here. This was the unforgivable thing she'd referenced, not just the general cruelty of Sarah's treatment, but the specific, deliberate destruction of her mind through electroshock therapy. ECT in 1979 wasn't what it would become decades later, a carefully controlled, medically supervised procedure with anesthesia and muscle relaxants. In places like Holloway, it was still a blunt instrument, a way to make difficult patients compliant, to erase memories that were inconvenient, to punish those who refused to accept the reality the institution imposed on them. How many treatments had Sarah endured? The file hadn't mentioned ECT, but that didn't surprise Maya. Documentation of such treatments was often deliberately vague, hidden behind euphemisms like intensive therapy or behavioral intervention. Sarah's memory of her son, her ability to hold onto the truth, that had been the target. They'd tried to erase Michael from her mind completely. Maya stood, her legs unsteady, and made her way out of the room. She needed to get out of this building, needed fresh air and distance and time to process what she'd learned. But as she walked back toward the stairwell, she noticed something she'd missed on her way in. Another door at the very end of the fourth-floor hallway, different from the patient rooms. It was labeled record storage. Her investigative instincts overrode her exhaustion and emotional overwhelm. If there were fourth-floor records, they might contain documentation that hadn't made it into Sarah's official file. Treatment logs, incident reports, notes that Dr. Meridian wouldn't have wanted in the permanent record. She tried the door and found it locked, but like the medical records room downstairs, the wood was rotted enough that a solid kick near the handle splintered the frame. The room was smaller, water-damaged, with boxes of files on metal shelves. Maya worked quickly through the soggy documents until she found the fourth-floor treatment logs. Sarah's patient number appeared frequently in late 1979. The logs were clinical, detached, recording treatments as if they were routine medical procedures rather than violations of human dignity. Patient 4782. ECT administered. 120 volts. 1.5 seconds. The patient exhibited standard convulsive response. Recovery unremarkable. The entries appeared weekly at first, then twice weekly, then 3 times in one particularly intensive period in December 1979. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins, added by someone other than Dr. Meridian, that told the real story. A nurse, maybe Ellen, maybe someone else who'd worked on the 4th floor, had documented Sarah's deterioration with heartbreaking precision. Patients increasingly disoriented after treatments. Can't remember her name when asked. Cries for her mother but doesn't recognize her during visits. And later, patient no longer speaks. Spends most of the day staring at the wall. No longer writes on walls. No longer shows recognition of surroundings or people. They'd succeeded. They'd broken her. They'd taken the young woman who'd written her son's name thousands of times, who'd held on to truth with everything she had, and they'd shattered her mind until there was nothing left to resist. Maya felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce. This wasn't just medical malpractice. This was torture. This was a deliberate campaign to silence a woman whose only crime had been loving her child and refusing to accept a lie. Dr. Meridian had destroyed Sarah to protect whatever arrangement had been made with St. Mary's, whatever kickback or professional courtesy had motivated the cover-up of Michael's adoption. She kept searching through the boxes, looking for anything that might tell her what had happened to Sarah after the hospital closed. The treatment logs ended in March 1982, when Holloway State Hospital officially ceased operations. There was a note from Dr. Meridian indicating that several long-term patients, including Sarah, were being transferred to other facilities. But there was no documentation of where Sarah had been sent, no transfer paperwork, no forwarding information. It was as if, once Holloway closed, Sarah had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. Maya was about to give up when she found a letter tucked into the back of the last box, protected from water damage by a folder that had kept it relatively dry. It was addressed to Dr. Meridian, dated February 1982, from someone named Margaret Brennan, Director of Patient Services at a facility called Riverside Care Center. Dear Dr. Meridian, the letter began. Thank you for your inquiry regarding placement options for your long-term care patients. I've reviewed the files you sent, and I'm afraid we cannot accept the patient you designated as most urgent. The young woman with the extensive psychiatric history and treatment-resistant symptoms. Riverside specializes in geriatric care, and we simply don't have the resources or staff training to handle younger patients with complex needs. I've attached a list of other facilities in the region that might be more appropriate. I hope this doesn't create too much difficulty as you work to close Holloway. Best regards, Margaret. Maya photographed the letter, her mind racing. Dr. Meridian had been trying to place Sarah in a nursing home, despite her being only 28 years old. Why would he do that unless Sarah's condition had deteriorated so severely that no psychiatric facility would take her? Or unless he was trying to hide her somewhere she'd never be found, never be questioned, never have the chance to tell her story? She searched for the list of alternative facilities Margaret had mentioned, but it wasn't in the box. Either it had been damaged beyond recovery, or Dr. Meridian had kept it elsewhere. Without knowing where Sarah had been sent after Holloway closed, Maya's trail had gone cold. But there was one person who might know. Eleanor Whitmore. Sarah's mother had been fighting to see her daughter right up until the hospital closed. Patricia Flores's notes had documented that much. If Sarah had been transferred to another facility, Eleanor would have been notified. She would have continued visiting, and continued trying to bring her daughter home. Maya checked her phone. No signal this deep in the building, which didn't surprise her. She needed to get back to civilization, get to somewhere with internet access and find Eleanor Whitmore. The woman would be in her 70s now, if she was still alive. But if Maya could find her, if she could talk to her, maybe Eleanor could fill in the gaps that the institutional records had left. She gathered all the documents she'd found, carefully placing them in plastic bags from her backpack to protect them from further water damage. Her collection now included Sarah's file, the treatment logs, Ellen's letter, the correspondence about placement facilities, and dozens of photographs documenting the conditions of the 4th floor. It was powerful evidence, the foundation of a story that would expose the abuses of the institutional mental health system and bring attention to Sarah's case specifically. But even as she organized her findings, Maya felt a nagging sense that she was missing something. The institutional paper trail ended in 1982, but that was 43 years ago. Sarah would be 68 now if she was still alive. What had happened to her in all those years? Had she ever recovered from the ECT treatments? Had Eleanor finally been able to bring her home? Or was Sarah still locked away somewhere? Another forgotten casualty of a system that had failed her at every turn? Maya made her way back to the stairwell, exhausted and emotionally drained. The climb down was treacherous. The water flowing down the stairs had made them slippery, and her flashlight was starting to dim, the batteries weakening after hours of use. She moved slowly, carefully, trying not to think about what would happen if she fell and injured herself in this abandoned building with no cell signal and no one knowing where she was. She was halfway down to the 3rd floor when she heard something that made her freeze. Voices. Faint, distant, but definitely voices, coming from somewhere below her. Her first thought was that other urban explorers had entered the building, but the voices had an odd quality to them, echoey and indistinct, like they were coming from far away or through water. Maya continued down more cautiously, listening. The voices faded, then returned, then faded again. She reached the 2nd floor and paused, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be emanating from the day room, the same place where she'd found the photograph of Sarah. Every rational part of her brain told her it was just the wind, or the rain, or the building settling, creating acoustic anomalies that sounded like voices. Old buildings did that, especially ones as damaged as Holloway. but there was something about the rhythm of the sounds, the rise and fall of them, that seemed too deliberate to be random. She walked toward the day room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The voices grew clearer, and now she could distinguish individual elements. A woman's voice, speaking urgently, and another voice responding, lower, masculine. She couldn't make out words, but the emotional content was clear. Distress, pleading, resistance. Maya reached the doorway of the day room and stepped inside, sweeping her flashlight around the space. Empty. Nothing had changed since her last visit. The piano still stood in its corner, the chairs and tables still scattered across the floor, the bulletin board still hanging on the wall with its water-stained papers. But the voices continued, and now Maya realized they were coming from above her. The third floor, directly overhead. She looked up at the ceiling and saw that there was a large hole, likely from water damage, that opened into the room above. The voices were carrying through that gap, echoing down into the day room. Relief washed over her. Not ghosts, not her imagination going haywire from stress and exhaustion. Just sound traveling through the damaged building in unexpected ways. Someone was on the third floor, probably urban explorers or vandals. She should probably leave, avoid any confrontation with people who might not appreciate her presence. But curiosity won out over caution, as it always did with Maya. She went back to the stairwell and climbed to the third floor, following the sound of voices to a ward she hadn't explored yet. This one looked like it had been for children. The doors were painted with faded cartoon characters, and the rooms were smaller than those on the adult wards. Maya's heart sank. Holloway had housed children too, kids who'd been institutionalized for reasons ranging from legitimate mental illness to simple behavioral problems that their parents couldn't or wouldn't deal with. The voices were coming from a room at the end of the hall. Maya approached slowly, announcing her presence. "Hello? Is someone there?" The voices stopped abruptly. Maya reached the doorway and shined her flashlight inside. The room was empty. She stepped in, checking the corners, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. No footprints in the dust. No disturbed debris. No indication that anyone had entered this room in years. But she'd heard voices, clear as day, coming from this exact location. Maya's skin prickled. She didn't believe in ghosts. She'd spent her career dealing with the very real horrors that living people inflicted on each other, and that was frightening enough without adding supernatural elements. But standing in that empty room, with the echo of voices she couldn't explain still ringing in her ears, she felt the first real stirrings of fear. She backed out of the room and returned to the hallway, deciding it was definitely time to leave. She'd been in the building for nearly 4 hours, and she had what she'd come for. The rest could wait for daylight and preferably some backup, maybe someone from the State Historical Society, or a colleague from the paper who could serve as a second witness to what she'd found. But as she turned toward the stairwell, her flashlight beam caught something on the wall that made her stop. It was a child's drawing, protected under glass in a small frame, remarkably well-preserved given the condition of everything else. The drawing showed a woman and a little boy holding hands, with a yellow sun overhead and flowers at their feet. At the bottom, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "Me and Mama," by Michael, age 6. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Michael. Couldn't be the same Michael, could it? Sarah's son would have been 6 in 1980, would have been old enough to draw pictures and write his name. But why would his artwork be hanging in Holloway State Hospital? Unless he'd been here. Unless Sarah's son, the baby she'd been told was dead, the child she'd fought so hard to remember, had been institutionalized in the same building where his mother was slowly being destroyed. Maya felt dizzy, nauseous. She leaned against the wall, trying to process this new revelation. It would explain why Dr. Meridian had been so determined to silence Sarah, why the ECT treatments had been so aggressive. It wasn't just about covering up an adoption. Michael had been here in Holloway, and if Sarah had ever seen him, if she'd ever recognized him, the entire lie would have collapsed. But why would a 6-year-old be institutionalized? What could possibly justify putting a child in a place like this? Maya carefully removed the drawing from the wall, the frame coming free easily from its hook. She turned it over and found a label on the back, Patient 6247. Michael Whitmore. Ward C. 1980. So the hospital had known who he was, had known his real name. They'd kept him here under his mother's surname, in a children's ward 1 floor above where Sarah was being held on the 4th floor. Had they ever seen each other? Had Sarah, in her increasingly fragmented mental state, ever caught a glimpse of a little boy and felt some recognition, some echo of maternal connection? Or had the ECT already stolen that from her by the time Michael arrived? Maya photographed the drawing and the label carefully. This changed everything. This wasn't just a story about a woman who'd been unjustly institutionalized. This was a story about a mother and son, both imprisoned in the same building, separated by a single floor and an institutional conspiracy that had stolen their chance to be a family. She had to find out what had happened to Michael. If Sarah's trail had gone cold after 1982, maybe his wouldn't. Children who'd been institutionalized in the 70s and 80s, there had been lawsuits, investigations, advocacy groups fighting for them. There might be records, there might be people who remembered. But first, she needed to get out of this building and process what she'd found. The emotional weight of the discoveries was becoming overwhelming, and she was starting to make mistakes, like removing the drawing from the wall instead of just photographing it in place, potentially compromising it as evidence. She needed rest, needed to think clearly, needed to approach this investigation with the professional detachment that had always served her well. She made her way back to the stairwell, clutching Michael's drawing carefully, and descended to the 1st floor. The rain had lessened somewhat, though water still dripped steadily through holes in the ceiling. Maya navigated back through the administrative wing, through the service corridor, and finally to the door she'd entered through. She stepped out into the night, and the fresh air hit her like a physical shock after hours in the stale, moldy atmosphere of the building. She stood in the rain for a moment, letting it wash over her, clean and cold and real. The storm was passing, the clouds beginning to break up, revealing patches of stars between the gaps. Maya walked to her car and climbed inside, locking the doors behind her. She sat in the driver's seat, not yet ready to turn the engine on, not yet ready to leave. She pulled out her phone. Signal had returned now that she was out of the building, and began searching for Eleanor Whitmore. It took 15 minutes and several different search strategies, but she finally found her. Eleanor Whitmore, age 74, living at Meadowbrook Assisted Living in Burlington, Vermont. There was a phone number listed, though Maya knew it was too late to call tonight. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and any decent person would be asleep. But there was also an email address, part of the facility's resident contact system. Maya opened her email and began to write. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Maya Chen. I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm writing a story about Holloway State Hospital. I've been researching your daughter Sarah's case, and I believe she suffered grave injustices during her time there. I've also found evidence that suggests your grandson Michael may have been institutionalized at Holloway as well. I know this email must be shocking and painful to receive, and I apologize for the intrusion. But I believe Sarah's story deserves to be told, and I'm hoping you might be willing to speak with me. I have questions about what happened after the hospital closed, and any information you could provide would be invaluable. I understand if you need time to consider this, or if you'd prefer not to engage at all. But please know that my intention is to honor Sarah's memory and to expose the institutional failures that harmed her and so many others. If you're willing to talk, I can come to Burlington at your convenience. Respectfully, Maya Chen. She read the email 3 times, editing and refining, trying to strike the right balance between professional distance and human empathy. Finally, she hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital ether. Now she just had to wait. Maya started the car and began the long drive back to Boston. The road was dark and mostly empty, giving her too much time to think, to replay everything she'd learned, to imagine the horrors that Sarah and Michael had endured. She thought about her own mother, about the guilt she still carried for all the ways she'd failed to be there during those final months. She'd been building her career, chasing stories, always planning to spend more time with her mom, next week, or after this article was finished. And then her mother had died. Suddenly, a stroke that came without warning. and Maya had been in Chicago covering a story about municipal corruption. She'd gotten the call from Rachel, had flown home immediately, but by the time she'd arrived at the hospital, her mother was already gone. "You have to forgive yourself," Rachel had told her at the funeral. Mom understood. She was proud of you, of the work you do. But Maya had never been able to shake the feeling that she'd made the wrong choice, that she'd prioritized other people's tragedies over her own family, and now it was too late to make it right. Maybe that was why Sarah's story affected her so deeply. Here was a mother and son who'd been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, who'd been victimized by institutions that were supposed to help them. If Maya could reunite them, if she could give Sarah's story the ending it deserved, maybe it would somehow balance the scales for the ending she'd failed to give her own mother. She knew it was irrational, knew it was her own grief talking, but she didn't care. This story mattered. Sarah and Michael mattered, and Maya would do whatever it took to find out what had happened to them. She was 20 minutes from her apartment when her phone buzzed with an incoming email. Maya pulled over to check it, her heart racing. It was from Eleanor Whitmore. "Dear Maya, I haven't slept well in 40 years. Every night, I wonder if my daughter is alive, if she's suffering, if she thinks I abandoned her. I've searched for her. God knows I've searched. But after Holloway closed, the trail went dead. They told me Sarah had been transferred, but they wouldn't say where. Patient privacy, they said, as if privacy was ever something they cared about when it came to my daughter. I'll tell you everything I know. But I need you to promise me something. If you find Sarah, if she's still alive, please tell her I never stopped looking. Tell her I'm sorry for sending her away. Tell her I loved her every single day. Come tomorrow if you can. I'll be waiting. Eleanor Whitmore." Maya sat in her parked car and typed a response. "I promise. I'll be there by noon. Thank you for trusting me with Sarah's story." She pulled back onto the road, no longer exhausted, no longer doubtful. She had a lead, she had a source, and she had a promise to keep. Sarah Whitmore's story was going to be told, and Maya Chen was going to be the one to tell it. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would find the truth. Maya barely slept. She made it back to her apartment at 2 in the morning, took a scalding shower to wash away the smell of decay and mildew from Holloway, and then sat at her kitchen table organizing the documents and photographs she'd collected. She created folders on her laptop, backed everything up to the cloud, made physical copies of the most important documents. By 6 a.m., she'd constructed a timeline of Sarah's life. Birth in 1955, pregnancy in 1973, admission to St. Mary's in late 1973, Michael's birth in March 1974, Sarah's commitment to Holloway the same month, the years of drugging and isolation, Patricia Flores's brief intervention in 1977, the escalation to the 4th floor in 1979, the ECT treatments, and then the void after 1982. And parallel to Sarah's timeline was Michael's, what little of it she could piece together. Born alive in March 1974, presumably adopted, but then somehow ending up at Holloway by age 6 in 1980. What had happened to his adoptive family? Had they returned him to the system? Had there been abuse, neglect, some tragedy that had resulted in his institutionalization? Maya made coffee, strong and black, and watched the sun rise over Boston while her mind churned through possibilities. At 8 a.m., she called her editor, Marcus Patterson, knowing he'd already be at his desk despite it being Sunday morning. Marcus lived for the paper, had been in journalism for 40 years, and had taught Maya most of what she knew about investigation and storytelling. "Chan," Marcus answered. His voice gravelly from decades of smoking he'd finally quit 5 years ago. "It's Sunday. This better be good." "I found something," Maya said. "A story that's going to be big, Marcus. Institutional abuse, cover-ups, a mother and son separated by lies and locked in the same asylum. I'm meeting with a source in Vermont today, but I need you to do something for me." "I'm listening." She heard him settling into his chair, could picture him pulling out his notebook, the same battered moleskine he'd been using since before Maya was born. "I need you to run a search through our archives. See if there was ever any coverage of Holloway State Hospital in Massachusetts, particularly around when it closed in 1982. I also need anything you can find on St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers, adoption scandals in the 70s, and any lawsuits related to children being institutionalized in psychiatric facilities during that era. That's a lot of ground to cover. I know. But I think there's a pattern here, Marcus. I think what happened to this woman, Sarah Whitmore, wasn't isolated. I think there was a system in place, a pipeline from unwed mothers to forced adoptions to institutionalization. I just need to prove it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its gruffness. You found another one, didn't you? Another story like your mother's. Maya closed her eyes. Marcus knew her too well, knew exactly what drove her, what demons she was trying to outrun. It's not like that. It's always like that with you, Maya. I'm not saying it's wrong. Your personal investment makes you a better journalist, makes you dig deeper than anyone else would. But you need to be careful. Don't let the story consume you. Don't lose yourself in someone else's tragedy. I won't, she said, though they both knew she was lying. Will you do the search? Already making notes. Call me after you meet with the source. And Maya? Be gentle with her. She's been carrying this for a long time. I will. Thanks, Marcus. Maya hung up and checked the time. She had 4 hours before she needed to leave for Vermont. She spent hours researching institutional abuse in the 1970s, the deinstitutionalization movement, the lawsuits, places like Willowbrook. Holloway wasn't unique. It was part of a nationwide pattern of institutional failure. At 10 a.m., Maya packed a bag with her recording equipment, fresh notebooks, and copies of the key documents she'd found. She drove north, through Massachusetts and into Vermont. The autumn landscape beautiful in a way that seemed at odds with the darkness of the story she was pursuing. The trees were in full fall color, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows against a sky so blue it looked painted. She arrived at Meadowbrook Assisted Living at noon exactly. The facility was nicer than she'd expected, a modern building designed to look like a large Victorian home, with well-maintained grounds and a welcoming entrance. Maya checked in at the front desk, and a kind-faced woman in scrubs led her to a common room where Eleanor Whitmore was waiting. Eleanor sat in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid with anxiety. She was smaller than Maya had imagined, thin and frail-looking, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that were the same shade of dark brown as Sarah's in the photographs. She wore a cardigan despite the warmth of the room, and her hands trembled slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, Maya said softly, approaching slowly. I'm Maya Chen. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. Eleanor looked up, her eyes bright with emotion. You found something. In your email, you said you found evidence about Sarah. About Michael. What did you find? Your email, you said you found evidence about Sarah. About Michael. What did you find? Maya sat down in the chair across from Eleanor and pulled out her tablet, opening the folder of photographs she'd taken. Before I show you these, I need to warn you, some of what I found is very difficult. Are you sure you want to see it? I've lived without knowing for 43 years, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tears. Whatever you find, it can't be worse than the stories I've imagined. Please, show me. Maya started with the photograph from the day room, the one with Sarah in the back row. She handed the tablet to Eleanor and watched the older woman's face crumble as she looked at her daughter. That's my Sarah, Eleanor whispered, tracing the image with one finger. I remember when she looked like that. So young, so sad. This was taken at Holloway? Yes, in 1979. I found it pinned to a bulletin board in what they called the day room. On the back, there's a note from a nurse named Ellen Hartley. Maya showed her the note. Sarah, please forgive me. And Eleanor's tears began to fall in earnest. Ellen. She was the one who was kind to Sarah, the only one. After they transferred Ellen away from Sarah's ward, things got so much worse. They wouldn't let me visit anymore. Said it was upsetting Sarah. But I knew it was because they didn't want me to see what they were doing to her. What were they doing, Mrs. Whitmore? What did you witness? Eleanor composed herself. The first few years Sarah was just absent. When I visited, she barely spoke, barely seemed to recognize me. The medications made her so drowsy she could barely keep her eyes open. But she was still Sarah, you know? I could still see her in there, buried under all the drugs and the institutional routine. Then in 1977, that social worker, Patricia, she found me. She told me Sarah's baby had been alive, that there had been a conspiracy to take him away and commit Sarah. I was devastated, furious. I hired a lawyer, started fighting to get Sarah released. Patricia was helping, documenting everything, building a case. But then Patricia lost her job, and my lawyer told me that fighting the hospital would be expensive and that we might not win. I was a seamstress, Ms. Chen. I didn't have money for a long legal battle. And they knew that. Dr. Meridian knew I was powerless. Knew I couldn't afford to fight him. Eleanor paused, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. Maya waited, giving her time. In 1979, they moved Sarah to the 4th floor. When I went to visit, they made me wait in a different room. Said Sarah was in intensive treatment and couldn't have regular visitors. But I heard her screaming. I heard my daughter screaming, and they wouldn't let me go to her. They said it was part of her treatment, that she was having an episode, that my presence would only make it worse. I tried to force my way past the orderlies. I was screaming too, demanding to see my daughter. They threatened to call the police, to have me arrested for trespassing. They said if I didn't leave voluntarily, they'd get a restraining order and I'd never be allowed back. So I left. God help me. I left my daughter there, screaming for help, and I walked away because I was afraid and powerless and I didn't know what else to do. Maya reached across and took Eleanor's hand. The old woman gripped it like a lifeline. You couldn't have saved her, Maya said gently. The system was designed to protect itself, not the patients. You did everything you could. Did I? Eleanor asked bitterly. Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like I failed her twice. Once when I sent her to St. Mary's, and again when I left her at Holloway. Maya showed her more photographs, Sarah's file, the treatment logs, the documentation of the ECT. Eleanor looked at each one, her face growing paler, her hands shaking more violently. They destroyed her mind, Eleanor whispered. They took my beautiful, bright daughter and they destroyed her mind because she knew the truth about her baby. Yes, Maya said. But there's more, Mrs. Whitmore. Something I found that I need to show you. She pulled up the photograph of Michael's drawing. Eleanor stared at it, not understanding at first, and then her eyes found the label on the back, found the name, and she made a sound like she'd been physically struck. Michael. He was there. My grandson was in that place. The drawing is dated 1980, which means he would have been 6 years old. I don't know yet how he ended up there or what happened to his adoptive parents. But yes, he was at Holloway, 1 floor above where they were keeping Sarah. Eleanor stood up abruptly, pacing to the window, her whole body shaking. Did she know? Did Sarah know her son was there? I don't know. The ECT treatments had already done significant damage by 1980. It's possible she saw him but didn't recognize him, or recognized him but couldn't understand what she was seeing. Or maybe they were kept separated deliberately. Eleanor turned back to Maya, and the expression on her face was one of such profound anguish that Maya had to look away. They were in the same building. My daughter and my grandson, both of them suffering, both of them alone, and they were in the same building. If I had known, if I had any idea. There was no way you could have known, Maya said firmly. They hid it from you. That was deliberate, Mrs. Whitmore. Someone made sure you didn't know Michael was there. Eleanor returned to her chair, suddenly looking at every one of her 74 years. What happened to them? After the hospital closed, where did they go? That's what I'm trying to find out. The institutional records end in 1982. There's documentation that Dr. Meridian was trying to place Sarah in nursing homes, but no record of where she ultimately ended up. And I haven't found any trail for Michael yet. I tried to find them, Eleanor said. For years I tried. I called every facility in Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire. I hired a private investigator in 1985, spent every penny of my savings. He found nothing. It was like they'd both just vanished. Maya leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something. Did you ever try contacting St. Mary's? Did you ever confront them about the lie they told you? About Michael being stillborn? Eleanor's face hardened. I went there in 1977, after Patricia told me the truth. But the home had closed in 1975. The building was abandoned, the records supposedly destroyed in a fire. Convenient, isn't it? The only people who could have told me what happened to Michael, and they were conveniently gone. Do you remember the names of any of the nuns who worked there? Anyone who might still be alive? Eleanor thought for a moment. There was one, Sister Catherine Brennan. She was in charge of adoptions. I remember her because she was the one who called to tell me about what I thought was Sarah's death. She was young then, couldn't have been more than 30. If she's still alive, she'd be in her 80s now. Maya made a note of the name. I'll try to find her. If anyone knows what happened to Michael's adoption, it would be her. They talked for another hour, Eleanor sharing memories of Sarah before everything went wrong. A bright, artistic girl who loved to paint and write poetry, who'd dreamed of becoming a teacher, who'd fallen in love with a boy named David who'd promised to marry her and then disappeared when she got pregnant. Eleanor showed Maya photographs from Sarah's childhood, and Maya saw the same sad eyes she'd seen in the hospital photo. But in these earlier pictures they were brightened by youth and hope and the belief that the world was basically good. She was 19, Eleanor said, looking at a photo of Sarah at her high school graduation. Just 19, and her whole life ahead of her. And I destroyed it because I was ashamed, because I cared more about what the neighbors would think than about supporting my daughter when she needed me most. You were a widow, struggling financially, in a time when unwed pregnancy carried enormous stigma, Maya said. You made the best decision you could with the information and resources you had. Don't make excuses for me, Eleanor said sharply. I know what I did. I know the choice I made. And I've paid for it every day since. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Eleanor asked the question Maya had been dreading. Do you think they're still alive? Sarah and Michael? Maya chose her words carefully. I think there's a chance, yes. Sarah would be 68, Michael would be 50. Those are very survivable ages. The question is whether they're living in circumstances where they can be found. And if you do find them, what then? Then I tell their story. I expose what was done to them, what was done to countless others in institutions like Holloway. I make sure that Sarah's voice is finally heard, that the truth she fought so hard to hold on to is finally acknowledged. Eleanor nodded slowly. And I would get to see my daughter again. After all these years, I might actually get to tell her I'm sorry. That's my hope, Maya said. That's my promise to you. They talked a while longer, with Eleanor sharing more details about Sarah's life before institutionalization, about her relationship with David, about the pregnancy and the decision to send her to St. Mary's. Maya recorded everything, documenting not just the facts but the emotional texture of the story, the human cost of the institutional failures. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, Maya prepared to leave. Eleanor walked her to the door, moving slowly, leaning on a cane Maya hadn't noticed when she'd arrived. Ms. Chen, Eleanor said. Maya, when you write this story, please make sure people understand that Sarah was more than just a victim. She was a whole person. Talented, intelligent, loving. She was my daughter, and I loved her. And what happened to her was wrong in ways that go beyond simple injustice. I will, Maya promised. I'll make sure everyone knows who Sarah was, not just what was done to her. She drove back to Boston as the sun set, her mind full of Eleanor's stories, Sarah's face, Michael's drawing. She thought about the responsibility she'd taken on, the weight of other people's grief and hope and desperate need for closure. Marcus had been right. She was losing herself in this story, letting it consume her. But how could she not? How could anyone hear what had happened to Sarah and Michael and not be consumed by it? Her phone rang as she crossed back into Massachusetts. It was Marcus. I found something, he said without preamble. There was an investigative series in the Boston Globe, 1984, about the closing of state institutions and what happened to the patients. Holloway was mentioned specifically. Apparently there was a scandal. Several patients who were supposed to be transferred to other facilities just disappeared. No records of where they went, no follow-up from state agencies. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. And by the time anyone noticed, The trail was too cold to follow. Maya's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Sarah could have been one of those patients. Yeah. But here's the interesting part, the reporter who wrote the series, Linda Morrison. She's still alive. Retired now, living in Cambridge. I've got her contact information if you want it. Text it to me. I'll call her tonight. There's more. I found records of a lawsuit filed in 1983 against the Archdiocese of Boston by a group of women who'd been forced to give up their babies at Catholic homes for unwed mothers. They claimed the adoptions were coerced, that they'd been told their babies were dead when they were actually given to adoptive families. The lawsuit was settled out of court, sealed records, but the allegations are a matter of public record. St. Mary's was Catholic, Maya said. Run by nuns. Exactly. I think you're onto something bigger than just one woman's story, Maya. I think this connects to a whole network of coerced adoptions and institutional abuse. Maya felt the familiar thrill of a story coming together, the pieces falling into place. Send me everything you found. I'll go through it tonight. Will do. And Maya, this is good work. Important work. But don't forget to take care of yourself. Okay? I will, Marcus. Thanks. She hung up and drove the rest of the way in silence, thinking about patterns, about systems, about the casual cruelty of institutions that ground up vulnerable people and called it care. By the time she got home, Marcus had sent her a thick file of documents, scanned newspaper articles, court records, advocacy group reports. Maya made more coffee and settled in at her kitchen table, reading through everything. The picture that emerged was damning. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, thousands of young women had been sent to Catholic homes for unwed mothers, told they would be cared for during their pregnancies and helped to make the best decisions for their babies. Instead, many had been subjected to emotional manipulation, told they were sinful and unfit to be mothers, pressured or coerced into signing adoption papers. Some of the women in the lawsuit claimed they'd been told their babies had died, only to discover years later that this was a lie. Others said they'd been drugged during labor and woke to find their babies gone. Adoption papers signed in their names, though they had no memory of signing them. And some, like Sarah, had resisted, had refused to give up their babies, and had been declared mentally unstable as a result. Institutionalization had been the solution for the difficult cases, the young women who wouldn't comply with the program. Maya found references to Dr. Richard Meridian in several of the documents. He served as a consulting psychiatrist for multiple Catholic homes for unwed mothers, providing evaluations that justified committing young women who were deemed psychologically unfit for motherhood. He'd made a career out of destroying young women's lives, all while maintaining the veneer of medical respectability. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but a quick search revealed that Dr. Meridian had died in 1995. Whatever secrets he'd carried, he'd taken them to the grave. But Sister Catherine Brennan might still be alive, might still have answers. Maya searched online, running the name through every database she could access. It took 2 hours, but she finally found a listing. Sister Catherine Brennan, resident at Holy Cross Retirement Community for Sisters in Albany, New York. Maya looked at the time. It's nearly 11 p.m. Too late to call, but not too late to send an email. She drafted a message, careful and respectful, explaining that she was researching St. Mary's Home for unwed mothers and hoping Sister Catherine might be willing to share her memories of working there. She hit send and immediately felt restless, unable to sit still, unable to wait for a response that might not come for days. She pulled out her notes on Michael, looking for any angle she hadn't explored yet. A 6-year-old boy, institutionalized in 1980. That meant his adoptive placement had failed sometime between 1974 and 1980. There should be records of that, court filings, social services reports, something to explain why a healthy 6-year-old had ended up in a psychiatric hospital. Maya started searching Massachusetts court records, looking for anything related to Michael Whitmore. It was tedious work, scrolling through thousands of entries, but she'd done this kind of research before, knew how to be patient and methodical. And then, at 1:30 in the morning, she found it. A court filing from 1979, a motion to terminate parental rights filed by the Department of Social Services regarding a minor child. Initials MW, age 5. The adoptive parents, David and Catherine Morrison, were requesting dissolution of the adoption on grounds that the child exhibited severe behavioral problems and posed a danger to their biological children. Maya's hands shook as she pulled up the full case file. The details were heartbreaking. Michael had apparently been a difficult child from the start, prone to tantrums, unable to bond with his adoptive parents, showing signs of what the 1979 evaluation called attachment disorder and possible early-onset mental illness. But reading between the lines, Maya saw a different story. Michael had been traumatized by separation from his mother, had acted out in ways that his adoptive parents had no patience or understanding for, and instead of getting him the help he needed, they'd labeled him as defective and sent him back into the system. The court had approved the termination of adoption, and Michael had been remanded to state custody. From there, the trail led to Holloway State Hospital, where a 5-year-old boy had been institutionalized because the system had nowhere else to put him. Maya's vision blurred with tears. Michael had spent at least 2 years at Holloway, maybe more. 2 years of his childhood, spent in an institution 1 floor below where his mother was being tortured, neither of them knowing the other was there. She kept searching, looking for what had happened to Michael after Holloway closed, and found nothing. Just like Sarah, he'd vanished into the bureaucratic void of 1982. But she had names now, David and Catherine Morrison. They might know what had happened to Michael after they'd given him up. They might have information that could help her track him down. Maya added them to her growing list of people to contact, and finally, exhausted beyond measure, she closed her laptop and stumbled to bed. She fell asleep with Sarah's face in her mind, with Michael's drawing burned into her memory, with Eleanor's grief weighing on her heart. And she dreamed of Holloway, of dark hallways and locked doors, of voices calling out that no one could hear, of a young woman and a little boy, separated by a single floor and an infinity of institutional cruelty, both of them searching for each other and never quite connecting. Tomorrow she will find them. Tomorrow she would bring their story into the light. She had made a promise, and Maya Chen never broke her promises. Maya woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the insistent buzz of her phone. She grabbed it, disoriented, and saw 3 missed calls from Marcus and a text that read, "Linda Morrison wants to meet. Today if possible. She says she has something you need to see." Maya checked the time. 7:30 a.m. She'd slept for less than 5 hours, but adrenaline surged through her system, wiping away exhaustion. She texted Marcus back, "Send me her address. I'll be there by 9. She showered quickly, dressed, and was out the door by 8:15 with a travel mug of coffee and her bag of research materials. Linda Morrison lived in a modest townhouse in Cambridge, not far from Harvard Square. Maya found parking on the street and knocked on the door at exactly 9 a.m. The woman who answered was in her 70s, with short silver hair and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore jeans and a sweater, and there was an intensity about her that reminded Maya of herself, the mark of someone who'd spent their life chasing truth. "Maya Chen," Linda said, not as a question but as a statement. "Marcus told me about you, said you were good, relentless. Come in." The townhouse was cluttered with books and papers, the organized chaos of a journalist's workspace that had never quite transitioned into retirement. Linda led Maya to a dining room table that was covered with file boxes and old newspapers. "Marcus said you're investigating Holloway State Hospital," Linda began, gesturing for Maya to sit. "Specifically, a patient named Sarah Whitmore and her son Michael." "That's right. I found documentation that they both disappeared after the hospital closed in 1982. Your articles mentioned that several patients went missing during the closures." Linda nodded, pulling out a thick folder. "It wasn't just Holloway. When Massachusetts started closing the state institutions in the early 80s, it was supposed to be a humanitarian effort, moving people out of institutional settings and into community care. But the funding for community programs never materialized, and the closures happened too fast. Hundreds of patients fell through the cracks." She opened the folder, revealing lists of names, each with a patient number beside it. "These are the people I was able to document who disappeared. Most were elderly or severely disabled, people who couldn't advocate for themselves. The state claimed they'd all been transferred to appropriate facilities, but when I started calling around, Nobody could account for them. Maya scanned the lists, her heart sinking. There were dozens of names, maybe hundreds. And there, on page 7, she found it. Sarah Margaret Whitmore, patient number 4782, Holloway State Hospital. Last known location, 4th floor ICU. No transfer documentation on file. I remember her case specifically, Linda said quietly. When I was doing my research, I spoke with a former nurse from Holloway. She told me about a young woman on the 4th floor who'd been subjected to extensive ECT, who'd been essentially erased by the treatments. The nurse felt guilty about it, said the whole 4th floor was a horror show. But by the time I tried to follow up, the woman had moved out of state and wouldn't talk to me anymore. That was probably Ellen Hartley, Maya said. I found her journal entries about Sarah. She died in 2003, but before she did, she documented what happened on the 4th floor. Linda's eyes widened. You have documentation? Primary sources. Maya pulled out copies of Ellen's notes, the treatment logs, the photographs. Linda studied them with the practiced eye of an investigative journalist, and Maya saw the exact moment when the story clicked into place for her, when she understood not just the facts but the human tragedy beneath them. This is extraordinary, Linda said. This is the kind of evidence I was searching for 30 years ago. With this, you could build a case that goes beyond just Sarah's story. You could expose the entire system. That's the plan, Maya said. But first I need to find out what happened to her. And to Michael. Do you have any leads on where patients went if they weren't officially transferred? Linda was quiet for a moment, her expression troubled. There were rumors. Nothing I could ever prove, which is why it didn't make it into my articles. But some of the advocacy groups I worked with suspected that certain patients, the ones who were most vulnerable, who had no family or whose families had abandoned them, were being sent to unlicensed facilities. Places that weren't part of the official mental health system. Like what? Private nursing homes. Worse, there was one place in particular that kept coming up in whispers. A facility in western Massachusetts called Riverside Manor. It advertised itself as a private care home for adults with special needs, but it wasn't licensed as a psychiatric facility and wasn't subject to regular inspections. The advocacy groups suspected it was basically a warehouse, a place to dump people the system didn't want to deal with. Maya felt her pulse quicken. Riverside. I saw that name in the documents. Dr. Meridian tried to place Sarah at a facility called Riverside Care Center, but they refused her. Different place, Linda said. Riverside Care Center was a legitimate geriatric facility in Springfield. Riverside Manor was in a town called Ashfield, way out in the hills. It closed in the mid-90s after a resident died and the family sued. But while it was operating, it was completely off the radar of state oversight. Do you know who ran it? Linda pulled out another file. A man named Robert Chen. No relation to you, I assume. Maya shook her head. Common name. Robert Chen had been an orderly at Holloway. After the hospital closed, he bought an old farmhouse in Ashfield and started taking in former patients. He claimed he was providing a family-style care environment, but the lawsuit that shut him down painted a different picture. Neglect, minimal medical care, patients living in squalor. Is he still alive? Died in 2001. But his daughter might be. She was involved in running the place. Her name was Jennifer Chun. She'd be in her 60s now. Maya made notes, her mind racing. This was a lead, a concrete direction to pursue. I need to find her. If Sarah was sent to Riverside Manor, Jennifer might know what happened to her. Linda stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a worn address book. She flipped through it, found what she was looking for, and wrote something on a piece of paper. This is the last address I had for Jennifer Chun, from when I was trying to reach her during my investigation. It's probably outdated, but it's a starting point. Maya took the paper, gratitude washing over her. Thank you. This is exactly what I needed. There's something else, Linda said, her voice careful. If you do find Sarah, if she's been living in facilities like Riverside Manor for the past 40 years, you need to prepare yourself for what you might find. Institutional living, especially in unlicensed facilities, does terrible things to people. The woman you find might not be the woman in those old photographs. I know. Maya said quietly. But I made a promise to her mother. I have to try. Linda nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then try. And when you write this story, make it count. Make people understand what we let happen to the most vulnerable among us. Maya left Cambridge with a new sense of purpose, driving west toward Ashfield. The address Linda had given her was for a house in a small town about 2 hours from Boston. We're now halfway through this investigation, and I promise you, the discoveries ahead will shock you even more than what you've already heard. If you're invested in finding out what happened to Sarah and Michael, hit that like button and share this story with someone who appreciates deep investigative journalism. Maya called Marcus from the road, updating him on what she'd learned. I'm going to need time for this story, she told him. Maybe a few weeks. This isn't something I can rush. Take the time you need, Marcus said. This is the kind of story that only comes along once in a career. Don't settle for anything less than getting it right. The drive took her through increasingly rural landscape, the suburbs giving way to small towns and then to genuine countryside. Ashfield was barely on the map, a cluster of old houses and farms surrounded by forests. Maya found the address Linda had given her, a small ranch house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. She knocked on the door, and after a long moment, a woman answered. She was in her early 60s, heavy-set, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that held wariness. Can I help you? The woman asked, her tone making it clear she wasn't eager to help anyone. I'm looking for Jennifer Chen, Maya said. My name is Maya, and I'm a journalist investigating what happened to patients from Holloway State Hospital after it closed. The woman's face hardened. I have nothing to say to journalists. My father's facility was shut down years ago, and we went through hell with the lawsuit. I'm not revisiting that. I'm not here to write about your father's facility, Maya said quickly. I'm trying to find a specific person, a woman named Sarah Whitmore who disappeared after Holloway closed. I have reason to believe she might have been sent to Riverside Manor. Jennifer started to close the door. I told you, I'm not talking about this. She has a mother who's been searching for her for 40 years, Maya said, desperation creeping into her voice. A mother who was told her daughter and grandson were dead, who's lived with guilt and grief for decades. I'm not trying to expose you or your family. I just want to know if Sarah was ever at your father's facility, and if so, where she went from there. Jennifer paused, her hand on the door, conflict clear on her face. Finally, she sighed. Come in. But I'm not promising anything. The inside of the house was cluttered but clean, filled with old furniture and the accumulated possessions of a long life. Jennifer led Maya to a small living room and gestured for her to sit. My father wasn't a bad man, Jennifer began, defensive. He tried to help people the system had abandoned. The conditions at Riverside Manor weren't ideal, but we did the best we could with limited resources. Maya chose her words carefully. I'm not here to judge your father. I just need information. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, then stood and left the room. She returned with a cardboard box, dusty and water-stained. After my father died, I kept some of his records. I don't know why. Maybe because I thought someday someone would come asking questions, would want to know what happened to the people who passed through that place. She opened the box and pulled out a ledger, the kind with columns for dates and names and notes. My father kept track of everyone who came to Riverside Manor. It wasn't official documentation. He couldn't submit it anywhere because the facility wasn't licensed. But he recorded everything. Maya's heart pounded as Jennifer flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. And then she stopped, her finger landing on a line of text. Sarah Whitmore. Admitted June 1982. Age 27. Previous residence, Holloway State Hospital. Medical condition. Post-ECT cognitive impairment. Chronic institutionalization. Maya felt tears spring to her eyes. She was there. How long did she stay? Jennifer ran her finger down the page, following Sarah's entries. 2 years. She left in 1984. Where did she go? Jennifer turned the page, and there, in her father's careful handwriting, transferred to care of family. Mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Maya couldn't breathe. Eleanor had found her. After years of searching, Eleanor had somehow located Sarah at Riverside Manor and brought her home. Are you sure? Maya asked, her voice shaking. This says Eleanor took her in 1984? That's what it says. I was just a teenager then, but I remember that case because my father was relieved. He'd been worried about Sarah. She wasn't doing well in our facility, wasn't engaging with anyone, barely eating. He knew she needed more care than we could provide. When her mother showed up, it felt like a miracle. Maya pulled out her phone with trembling hands and called Eleanor. The phone rang 4 times before the older woman answered. Maya, did you find something? Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something very important. Did you find Sarah in 1984? Did you bring her to live with you? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. How did you know that? I found records. You took her from a facility called Riverside Manor. Yes, Eleanor said. I never stopped looking for her, Maya. I hired investigators, I called facilities all over New England. I spent every penny I had. And in 1984, I finally got a tip from someone who'd worked at Holloway. They told me about Riverside Manor, said some of the Holloway patients had ended up there. I drove out there, and I found my Sarah. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Eleanor's voice broke. Because finding her wasn't a happy ending. The Sarah I brought home wasn't the daughter I'd lost. The ECT had damaged her so badly, Maya. She didn't recognize me at first. She could barely speak. She was like a ghost, going through the motions of living but not really there. I took care of her for 18 years. I learned how to help her through the bad days, how to celebrate the small victories when she'd remember something or say my name. And slowly, so slowly, she came back to me. Not all the way. She never fully recovered from what they did to her, but enough. Enough that I got to have my daughter back, at least in part. Maya's tears were flowing freely now. Where is she now, Mrs. Whitmore? Is Sarah still alive? She's here, Eleanor said. She's been here at Meadowbrook with me for the past 7 years. When I had my stroke in 2018 and couldn't live independently anymore, they let me bring her with me. We share a room. She's sitting right here, looking at the birds outside our window. Maya's mind reeled. Sarah was alive. She was alive and she was with her mother, and they'd had 18 years together. It wasn't the ending Maya had expected, but it was so much better than the alternatives she'd imagined. Can I meet her? Maya asked. Would she be willing to talk to me? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I don't know if she can tell you her story, Maya. The damage from the ECT never fully healed. She has good days and bad days. On good days, she can hold a conversation, can remember things from her past. On bad days, she's lost in fragments of memory, confused about what's real. But I can ask her. I can see if she's willing to try. I'll come back to Vermont, Maya said. Tomorrow, if that's all right. I have one more question first. Do you know what happened to Michael? Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. That's the one thing I could never give Sarah back. I searched for him too, Maya, for years. But I never found him. Adoption records were sealed, and even with a lawyer I couldn't get them opened. The trail just went cold. Maya thought about the research she still needed to do, the leads she still needed to follow. I'm not giving up on finding him. If he's out there, I'll track him down. I hope you do, Eleanor said. Because even on her bad days, Sarah talks about Michael. She remembers his name. She remembers that he was real, that she was right all along. It would mean everything to her to know what happened to him. Maya hung up and sat in Jennifer's living room, trying to process everything she'd learned. Sarah was alive. After 40 years of institutionalization, abuse, and separation, she was alive and living with her mother. It was a kind of justice, however incomplete. Are you all right? Jennifer asked quietly. Maya wiped her eyes. I am. Thank you for showing me these records. You have no idea how much this means. Jennifer nodded. My father made a lot of mistakes with Riverside Manor. The lawsuit was justified. We weren't equipped to provide proper care. But every now and then, something went right. Sounds like this was one of those times. Maya left Ashfield with copies of the Riverside Manor records and drove back toward Boston, her mind churning with the next steps of her investigation. She needed to find Michael. For Sarah, for Eleanor, for the completion of the story that had consumed her for the past week. She called Marcus again. "I need you to help me track down someone." Michael Whitmore, born March 1974, adopted and then returned to the system in 1979, institutionalized at Holloway until 1982. After that, the trail goes cold. "That's a tough search," Marcus said. "He might have changed his name, might have been adopted again. He's 50 years old now. Could be anywhere, could be anyone." "I know, but we have to try. Can you reach out to our contacts in social services? See if anyone can access sealed adoption records?" "I'll make some calls. But Maya, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we might not find him. Or that if we do, he might not want to be found." "I understand. But I have to try." Over the next 3 days, Maya exhausted every lead. Adoption agencies, social workers, sealed records, public databases. A sympathetic social worker accessed Michael's case file. He'd been sent to a group home after Holloway, then aged out at 18. After that, the trail went cold. And then, on the 4th day of her search, she got an email from Sister Catherine Brennan. "Dear Ms. Chun," the email began, "I received your inquiry about St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers. I am an old woman now, and I have carried many regrets from my years of service. If you are willing to come to Albany, I will tell you what I know about the adoptions that took place during my time at St. Mary's. I will tell you about Sarah Whitmore and her son. It is time for the truth to be told. Sister Catherine." Maya booked a flight to Albany that same day. She arrived at Holy Cross Retirement Community that evening and was led to a small sitting room where Sister Catherine waited. The nun was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with a face creased by age and eyes that held profound sorrow. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Maya said, sitting across from her. Sister Catherine folded her hands in her lap. "I have prayed for years for the courage to speak about what happened at St. Mary's. Your email felt like a sign that it was finally time." She told Maya everything. About the pressure placed on young women to give up their babies, about the lies told to parents and families, about the adoptions arranged with wealthy couples willing to pay substantial donations to the church. About Sarah, who had refused to sign the papers, who had insisted her baby was alive when Sister Catherine and the others told her he was stillborn. "We convinced ourselves we were doing God's work," Sister Catherine said, tears streaming down her aged face. "We told ourselves these babies were going to good homes, that we were saving them from lives of shame and poverty. But we were taking children from their mothers, and we were lying about it. Sarah knew the truth, and we punished her for it." "What happened to Michael?" Maya asked gently. "Who adopted him?" Sister Catherine stood and walked to a small desk in the corner. She pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. "I kept this. I knew someday I would need to make this right." She handed the envelope to Maya. Inside was a copy of an adoption certificate. Michael Whitmore, adopted in April 1974 by David and Catherine Morrison of Newton, Massachusetts. But there was more. Clipped to the certificate was a newspaper article from 2018. The headline read, "Local teacher honored for work with at-risk youth." The accompanying photo showed a man in his mid-40s. The age was wrong, but that could be an old photo, standing with a group of teenagers. The caption read, "Michael Morrison, who overcame a difficult childhood to become an advocate for foster children, receives the Governor's Award for Public Service." Maya's hands shook. "Is this him?" "I believe so," Sister Catherine said. "I followed his life from a distance, praying for him, hoping he found happiness despite what we did to him. When I saw this article, I wept with gratitude that he'd survived, that he'd found purpose." Maya stared at the photo, at the man who might be Sarah's son, who had spent his childhood being shuffled between families and institutions, who had somehow survived it all and dedicated his life to helping other children in similar situations. Does he know about Sarah? Does he know his adoption was based on a lie? "I don't know," Sister Catherine said, "but he deserves to know the truth. They both do." Maya left Albany with the article, with Sister Catherine's tearful confession recorded on her digital recorder. with a lead that felt solid for the first time in days. She found Michael Morrison online, a counselor and advocate working in Boston. She'd been searching the country when he was in her city all along. She stared at the blank email, trying to find the right words. How do you tell someone that everything they thought they knew about their origin was a lie? How do you offer someone the mother they'd been told was dead? Finally, she wrote, "Dear Mr. Morrison, my name is Maya Chen, and I'm an investigative journalist working on a story about Holloway State Hospital and St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers. I've recently uncovered information about adoption practices in the 1970s that I believe may be relevant to your personal history. I understand this email must seem strange and possibly upsetting, but I have reason to believe that your birth mother, Sarah Whitmore, is alive and has been searching for you for 50 years. If you're willing to speak with me, I can explain everything I found. This is not a decision to make lightly, and I will respect whatever choice you make. But I wanted you to know that your mother never forgot you, never stopped loving you, and never stopped fighting to hold on to the truth of your existence. Respectfully, Maya Chen." She stared at the email for 5 minutes before finally hitting send. Then she closed her laptop and sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, wondering if she'd done the right thing, hoping that Michael Morrison would be willing to hear the truth about where he came from. Her phone rang 2 hours later. Unknown number. "This is Maya Chen," she answered. "This is Michael Morrison." His voice was quiet, controlled, but Maya could hear the emotion beneath it. "I got your email. I need you to tell me everything." And so she did. Maya met Michael Morrison at a quiet coffee shop in Cambridge the next morning. She arrived early, ordering tea she didn't drink, watching the door with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. When he walked in, she recognized him immediately from the newspaper photo, though he was older now, in his early 50s, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both hardship and laughter. He was tall, lean, with his mother's dark eyes and something in the set of his jaw that reminded Maya of Eleanor. He scanned the coffee shop until he found her, and she raised her hand in a small wave. He approached slowly, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful guardedness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Michael," she said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for meeting me." "I almost didn't come," he said, sitting across from her. "I spent all night reading everything I could find about you, making sure you were who you said you were. I've been lied to enough in my life. I needed to be sure this wasn't another manipulation." "I understand," Maya said. "I have documentation, photographs, records. I can show you everything I've found. But before I do, I need to ask, what do you know about your adoption? About your birth mother?" Michael took a deep breath, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he'd bought at the counter. "I was told she died shortly after I was born. Complications from delivery, they said. I was adopted by David and Catherine Morrison when I was a few weeks old. That adoption lasted until I was 5. They returned me to the system because I was, and I quote, unmanageable and possibly disturbed." His voice was bitter, but controlled, the bitterness of old wounds that had scarred over but never fully healed. "I spent the next year being shuffled between foster homes and group facilities. Eventually, I ended up at Holloway State Hospital. I was 6 years old, and I was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility because nobody knew what else to do with me." Maya's heart broke for him. "Do you remember Holloway?" "Fragments," he said. "I remember being scared all the time. I remember the nurses, some kind, most indifferent. I remember drawing pictures and writing my name over and over because I was afraid I'd forget who I was. And I remember," he paused, his voice catching, "I remember a woman, on a different floor. I saw her once through a doorway when they were moving me between rooms. She was staring at me, and there was something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just desperate hope. I asked the nurse who she was, and she told me to mind my own business, that I wasn't supposed to be looking at the adult wards. That was her. That was Sarah. Your mother." Michael's hands tightened on his cup. "You're telling me my mother wasn't dead? That she was in the same building where they'd locked me up?" "Yes. I found her file, found the documentation of what they did to her. She never gave you up, Michael. She fought to keep you, and they punished her for it. They told her grandmother, your grandmother Eleanor, that you were stillborn. They told you that Sarah was dead. And they kept you both in the same institution, one floor apart. Michael stood abruptly, walking to the window, his back to Maya. She watched him struggle to contain his emotions, saw his shoulders shake with silent grief or rage or both. After a long moment, he returned to the table. "Show me," he said. "Show me everything." Maya opened her laptop and began laying out the evidence. Sarah's file, the birth certificate showing he'd been born alive, the adoption papers, the court documents showing the Morrisons' termination of the adoption, the records of his institutionalization at Holloway. Michael studied each document carefully, his expression growing more strained with each revelation. When she showed him the photograph of Sarah from the day room, he stared at it for a long time. "She looks so sad," he said quietly. "Even in this group photo, surrounded by people, she looks completely alone." "She was," Maya said. "They isolated her, drugged her, did everything they could to make her forget you. But she never did. I found a room on the 4th floor where she'd written your name thousands of times on the walls. His name is Michael. He is alive." Over and over again. Michael put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Maya sat quietly, giving him space to process the enormity of what he'd just learned. When he finally raised his head, he looked exhausted but resolute. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were red but clear. "Is she still alive, Sarah? My mother. Is she still alive?" "Yes," Maya said. "She's living at Meadowbrook Assisted Living in Vermont with Eleanor, your grandmother. Eleanor found her in 1984 and has been caring for her ever since. The ECT treatments damaged her mind badly, but she's recovered significantly over the years. She has good days and difficult days, but she's there, Michael. She's alive, and she remembers you." "Does she remember me?" "Eleanor says that even on her worst days, Sarah talks about you. She never forgot your name. She never stopped believing you were real." Michael was quiet for a long time, processing. Finally, he asked, "Does she know about me? Does she know I'm alive? That I survived?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, to make sure you wanted this reunion before I said anything to her." "Do I want it?" Michael laughed, a sound without humor. "I've spent my entire life feeling like I was missing something, like there was a piece of me that never quite fit. I became a counselor because I kept trying to understand why I was the way I was, why attachment was so hard for me, why I always felt like I was waiting for someone who never came. And now you're telling me that someone was real, that she was there all along, locked in the same building, and we never knew." "I'm sorry," Maya said. "I'm sorry for everything that was done to you, to both of you." "It's not your fault," Michael said. "You're trying to make it right. That's more than anyone else has ever done." He looked at her directly. "When can I meet her? When can I meet my mother?" They made the drive to Vermont together 2 days later. Michael had needed time to prepare himself, to process what he'd learned, to decide what he wanted to say. Maya had called ahead, speaking with Eleanor to explain that she'd found Michael, that he was alive and well and wanted to meet them both. Eleanor had wept on the phone, had asked Maya to repeat it 3 times because she couldn't believe it was real. "My grandson," she kept saying. "My Sarah's boy. After all these years." They'd agreed to meet at Meadowbrook on a Saturday morning. Maya drove, with Michael quiet beside her for most of the journey, staring out the window at the passing landscape. "Are you nervous?" Maya asked as they crossed into Vermont. "Terrified," Michael admitted. "What if she doesn't recognize me? What if seeing me upsets her? Eleanor said she has bad days. What if this is a bad day? Then we'll try again another day," Maya said gently. "There's no rush. We have time now." "Do we?" Michael asked. "She's 68. Eleanor is 74. How much time do any of us really have?" Maya had no answer to that. They arrived at Meadowbrook at 11 a.m. Eleanor was waiting in the common room, and when she saw Michael walk through the door, she stood so quickly she nearly fell. Michael crossed the room to her, and they stood facing each other for a moment, this grandmother and grandson who'd been denied each other for 50 years. "You look like her," Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his face. You have her eyes. And my David's jaw, your grandfather's jaw. Oh, Michael. He embraced her then, and they held each other while Maya hung back, giving them privacy for this moment. When they finally separated, Eleanor was crying and smiling at the same time. She's having a good day, Eleanor said. I told her this morning that someone was coming to visit, someone she'd been wanting to see for a very long time. She's been asking about you all morning. Does she understand? Does she know who I am? I think she knows in the way that matters, Eleanor said carefully. Her memory isn't what it was. The ECT took so much from her. But her heart remembers what her mind sometimes forgets. Eleanor led them down a hallway to a room near the end. The door was open, and through it, Maya could see a woman sitting by the window, backlit by autumn sunlight. She was small, thin, with gray hair that still held hints of the dark brown it had once been. She wore a simple blue dress and held a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. Eleanor knocked gently on the doorframe. Sarah, honey? Your visitor is here. Sarah turned from the window, and Maya saw her face clearly for the first time. The sadness from the old photographs was still there, etched into the lines around her eyes and mouth. But there was something else too, a softness, a peace that came from being loved and cared for. She looked at Eleanor first, smiling, and then her gaze moved to Michael. The change in her expression was immediate and profound. Her eyes widened. Her hand moved to her heart, and she made a small sound. Surprise and recognition and joy all tangled together. Michael? She said, her voice uncertain but hopeful. Is it? Are you? Michael stepped into the room, his own eyes filling with tears. Yes, it's me. It's Michael. Sarah stood, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed the room to him. She was tiny compared to his height, and she had to look up at him, studying his face with an intensity that seemed to catalog every feature. You're so tall, she said wonderingly. You were so small when they took you. So small, and you cried so loudly, and they wouldn't let me hold you. But I could hear you crying, and I knew you were alive. I told them you were alive, but nobody believed me. I believe you, Michael said, his voice breaking. I believe you, Mom. The word Mom seemed to unlock something in Sarah. She reached up and touched his face, the same gesture Eleanor had made, and tears streamed down her cheeks. I looked for you, she said. Every day, I looked for you. I wrote your name so they wouldn't forget, so I wouldn't forget. His name is Michael. He is alive. I know, Michael said, taking her hands in his. I saw what you wrote. I know you never forgot me. Sarah's face crumpled, and she began to cry in earnest, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to carry 50 years of grief and loss and desperate love. Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her while she wept, and over her head, his eyes met Maya's. Thank you, he mouthed. Maya stepped back into the hallway, giving them privacy. Eleanor joined her, and they stood together in the corridor, listening to the sounds of reunion filtering through the door. I never thought I'd see this day, Eleanor said quietly. I prayed for it every night, but I never truly believed it would happen. Sarah never gave up, Maya said. Even when they tried to erase him from her mind, even when everyone told her she was wrong, she held on to the truth. That kind of love doesn't just disappear. Epilogue 3 years later. Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Eleanor and Michael at her bedside. She'd had those precious years knowing her son, being believed, having her truth finally acknowledged. Maya's 5-part series on institutional abuse won multiple awards and sparked reforms across Massachusetts. More importantly, it helped dozens of other families reunite with loved ones they thought were lost forever. Michael continued his advocacy work, now armed with his mother's story and an unshakable commitment to reforming the systems that had failed them both. And in a small cemetery in Vermont, beneath autumn leaves and endless sky, a mother and her truth rested at last in peace. If this story moved you, please like and share it so others can learn about Sarah and Michael's journey. Let me know in the comments what aspect of this investigation affected you most. Subscribe for more stories that matter. stories of truth, justice, and the power of never giving up. Maya documented everything with Eleanor and Michael's permission. The reunion, the conversations, the slow unfolding of a relationship that should have existed all along. Sarah had good moments and difficult ones. Sometimes she was fully present, asking Michael about his life, telling him stories about his grandfather David, sharing fragments of memory from before everything went wrong. Other times she grew confused, lost in memories that didn't quite connect, calling Michael by his grandfather's name or asking Eleanor when they were going home to a house that no longer existed. But through it all, she never forgot who Michael was. Even in her most confused moments, she knew him as her son, as the child she'd fought to remember. And Michael was patient with her, gentle, asking questions and listening to whatever answers she could give, building a relationship from the scattered pieces of shared biology and 50 years of absence. On the third day, Maya sat down with all three of them, Eleanor, Sarah, and Michael, and recorded their oral histories. She asked them each what they wanted people to know, what they wanted the world to understand about what had happened to them. Eleanor spoke about guilt and redemption, about the mistakes she'd made and the years she'd spent trying to atone for them. "I sent my daughter away because I was ashamed," she said. "And that choice led to everything else. The lies, the institutionalization, the separation. I can't take it back. I can't undo the damage. But I got her back eventually, and now I have my grandson too. That's more grace than I deserve." Michael talked about the foster care system, about the children who slipped through the cracks because society had decided they were too difficult, too damaged, too expensive to care for properly. "I was one of the lucky ones," he said. "I survived. I found a path forward. But there were so many others at Holloway, kids younger than me who never made it out. Their stories matter too. Whatever you write about my mother and me, please don't forget them." And Sarah, on one of her clearest days, spoke about institutional abuse and the erasure of women's voices. "They tried to make me forget," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "They tried to take away my memories, my truth, my son. They used medicine and electricity and isolation to break me. And for a long time they succeeded. But I'm still here. I survived. And Michael survived. And that means they didn't win completely." Maya returned to Boston with hours of recorded interviews, hundreds of photographs, and a story that had grown far beyond what she'd initially imagined. She spent the next month writing, crafting a narrative that honored Sarah and Michael's experiences, while also exposing the systemic failures that had enabled their suffering. The article ran as a 5-part series in the Boston Globe, under the headline "Separated by Lies: How Institutional Abuse Tore a Mother and Son Apart." Marcus had fought for front-page placement, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Advocacy groups contacted Maya, wanting to use Sarah and Michael's story to push for reforms in mental health care and adoption practices. Former patients from Holloway and similar institutions reached out, sharing their own experiences, creating a chorus of voices that had been silenced for too long. Lawyers approached Michael and Eleanor about potential lawsuits against the archdiocese and the state agencies that had failed in their duty of care. But the response that mattered most to Maya came from Sister Catherine, who called 3 days after the first article ran. "I've been contacted by the archdiocese," the old nun said. "They're considering an official apology for the practices at St. Mary's and other Catholic homes for unwed mothers. They want to create a compensation fund for the families who were harmed. It's not enough, it can never be enough, but it's a start. And it's happening because you told Sarah's story." Maya also heard from Linda Morrison, who praised the depth and sensitivity of the reporting. "This is the story I tried to tell 30 years ago," Linda said. "But I didn't have the evidence you found, didn't have the personal connection to make people care. You did what I couldn't. You made them see these people as human beings, not just statistics." The series won awards, journalism prizes that Maya had once coveted but now seemed less important than the real-world impact of the work. The Massachusetts Department of Mental Health launched an investigation into patient transfers during the institutional closures of the 1980s, trying to account for the hundreds of people who had disappeared from official records. Reform legislation was introduced to prevent similar abuses in current psychiatric facilities. But for Maya, The real victory wasn't in the awards or the policy changes. It was in the phone call she received from Michael 6 months after the articles ran. "I'm calling from Vermont," he said. "I've been spending weekends up here, getting to know Sarah and Eleanor. And today, Sarah had one of her best days yet. She told me about my father, a boy named David who she loved when she was 18. She told me about her dreams of becoming a teacher, about the poetry she used to write. She's been drawing again. Did you know that? Eleanor got her some art supplies, and she's been making these beautiful sketches of birds and flowers." "That's wonderful," Maya said, genuinely happy. "It is. And I wanted to tell you something else. I've been talking with Eleanor and we've decided to write a book together. A memoir about our family, about what happened to us and how we found each other. We want you to help us write it." Maya was quiet for a moment, overwhelmed. "Michael, I'm honored. But are you sure? Writing a book means revisiting all of this in even more detail." "I'm sure," he said, "because there are still so many people out there who don't know what happened to their families, who are searching for answers the way Eleanor searched for Sarah, the way I searched without even knowing what I was looking for. If our story can help even one person find their way back to their family, it's worth it." They started working on the book that spring. Maya traveled to Vermont regularly, conducting interviews, organizing materials, helping Michael and Eleanor shape their memories into narrative. Sarah participated when she was able, offering details and emotions that only she could provide. The process was difficult, often painful. There were days when Sarah couldn't remember anything, when the fog descended and she retreated into herself. There were days when Michael struggled with anger at the injustices that had shaped his childhood. There were days when Eleanor was overcome by guilt, wondering aloud if she should be telling this story at all, if she had any right to redemption. But there were also moments of grace and beauty. Sarah's memory of meeting David at a church social when she was 17. How he'd asked her to dance and she'd said yes even though she was terrified. Michael's recollection of a kind nurse at Holloway who had snuck him extra dessert and told him stories. Eleanor's description of the day in 1984 when she'd brought Sarah home. How her daughter had fallen asleep in the car with her head on Eleanor's shoulder, and Eleanor had cried the whole drive back to Vermont, grateful beyond words to have her child back. The book took 2 years to write. It was published in the fall, a slim volume with a photograph of Sarah and Michael together on the cover. A recent photo, both of them smiling, her hand in his. The title was simple. His Name is Michael, A Mother's Truth. The book launch was held at an independent bookstore in Cambridge, and the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Former patients from Holloway came, sharing their stories with Sarah and Michael. Adoption reform advocates came, grateful for the ammunition the book provided in their ongoing battles. And journalists came, Maya's colleagues who understood the significance of this story, the layers of reporting and human connection that had made it possible. Sarah attended, though Eleanor had been worried it might be too overwhelming for her. She sat in a comfortable chair at the front of the room, Michael on one side and Eleanor on the other, and listened as Michael read selected passages from the book. When he reached the section about Sarah writing his name on the walls of her room at Holloway, about her desperate insistence that he was alive, Sarah reached over and took his hand. "I never forgot," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet bookstore. "They tried to make me forget, but I never did. A mother knows her child. A mother remembers." The room erupted in applause and Maya, standing at the back, found herself crying again. She'd cried so many times during this journey, at Holloway with Eleanor, during interviews with Michael, while writing her articles and helping with the book. She'd let this story break her open in ways she'd never allowed before, had let it touch the grief she carried about her own mother. And in the process, she'd found something she hadn't expected. Not healing exactly. She didn't think grief worked that way, didn't think it could be fixed or resolved. But understanding, maybe. Acceptance. A recognition that the work she did, the stories she told, mattered not because they could change the past but because they could honor it, could bear witness to suffering and survival and the stubborn persistence of love. After the reading, after the questions and the book signings and the photographs, Maya found herself alone with Michael and Sarah for a few minutes while Eleanor chatted with old friends from Vermont who'd made the trip. "Thank you," Sarah said to Maya, her eyes lucid and focused. Thank you for finding my son. Thank you for believing me. You never needed me to believe you, Maya said. You already knew the truth. I just helped other people see it. But that matters, Michael said. Bearing witness matters. Making sure these stories aren't forgotten. That's the work that changes things. Maya thought about her mother, about the last conversation they'd had before she'd flown to Chicago for that story that had seemed so important at the time. Her mother had said, "I'm proud of you, Maya. You're doing important work." And Maya had said, "I'll visit when I get back. We'll have time then." But there hadn't been time. There was never as much time as you thought there'd be. "I learned something from your story," Maya said to Sarah and Michael. "I learned that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from, those stories matter. And when those stories are taken from us, when we're told lies about our own histories, it does real damage. But the truth has power too. The truth can heal, even after decades of lies." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm healing," she said. "Slowly. Some days are harder than others. But I'm healing because I have my mother back, and I have my son, and the truth is finally known. That's enough. That has to be enough." 3 years after the book was published, Maya received a call from Eleanor. It was early morning, and she knew before answering that something had happened. "Sarah passed away last night," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her grief. Peacefully in her sleep. "Michael was here. We were both here." Maya's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor." "Don't be," Eleanor said. She had 7 good years knowing her son. She had people who loved her, who believed her, who honored her truth. "That's more than I thought she'd ever have. We held a vigil last night, Michael and I. We told her stories, reminded her of all the beautiful moments we'd shared. And I told her it was okay to let go, that we would be all right, that her story would live on." The funeral was small, intimate. Just family and close friends, held at a chapel in Vermont with views of the mountains Sarah had loved. Michael delivered the eulogy, talking about his mother's strength, her refusal to be silenced, her fierce love that had transcended distance and time and institutional cruelty. "My mother spent most of her life being told she was wrong," Michael said. "Wrong about me, wrong about her own memories, wrong about her own mind. But she was right. She was right about everything that mattered. And in the end, that truth won out over all the lies." Eleanor spoke too, briefly, her voice shaking with emotion. "I failed my daughter in so many ways, but in the end, I got to bring her home. I got to take care of her the way I should have from the beginning. I got to tell her every day that I loved her, that I was sorry, that she was good and brave and true. That's grace. That's redemption. And I'm grateful beyond words for the years we had." Maya delivered a reading, a poem Sarah had written in high school, recovered from Eleanor's collection of keepsakes. It was about hope and belonging and the search for home, written by a 17-year-old girl who had no idea what lay ahead of her, but whose words resonated across the decades with prescient wisdom. After the service, Maya stood at the graveside with Michael and Eleanor, watching as Sarah was laid to rest next to the empty plot Eleanor had bought for herself years ago. "She's at peace now," Eleanor said quietly. "All the suffering, all the confusion, all the pain. It's over. She's free." "Do you believe in heaven?" Maya asked, not sure why she was asking, except that standing at a graveside made her think about her own mother, about what came after. "I believe in love," Eleanor said. "I believe that the love we give and receive, that's what echoes into eternity. Sarah loved Michael from the moment he was born, and that love survived everything they did to try to destroy it. If that's not divine, I don't know what is." Maya visited the grave once more before leaving Vermont, standing alone in the cemetery as the sun set behind the mountains. She thought about Sarah's life, the tragedy and the trauma, but also the resilience and the eventual reunion. She thought about the impact of Sarah's story, the reforms it had helped inspire, the families it had helped reunite. And she thought about her own mother, about the guilt she'd carried for not being there at the end. Maybe Marcus and Rachel had been right. Maybe she'd been chasing other people's stories to avoid facing her own grief. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the work still mattered, even if her motivations were complicated. She pulled out her phone and called Rachel for the first time in months. "Maya." Rachel answered, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," Maya said. I wanted to tell you about this story I've been working on. About a mother and son who were separated by institutional abuse, who found each other after 50 years. And I wanted to say that I'm sorry for all the times I wasn't there, for all the ways I let my work take precedence over family." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Mom wouldn't want you to feel guilty. She was proud of you, Maya. She understood why you do what you do." "I know, but I still wish I'd been there more. I wish I'd made different choices." "We all wish that," Rachel said gently. "But we can't change the past. We can only move forward. And maybe the work you're doing, telling these stories, helping families find each other, maybe that's your way of honoring Mom, of making meaning out of loss." "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been the wise sister. You were too busy chasing stories to notice." They talked for another hour, really talked, sharing memories of their mother and updates on their lives. When Maya finally hung up, she felt lighter than she had in years. She returned to Boston and to her work, but something had shifted. She still took on difficult investigations, still pursued stories that mattered. But she also made time for Rachel, for friends, for the life she'd been neglecting in her pursuit of other people's truths. And she kept in touch with Michael and Eleanor. Michael had become a friend, someone she could call when she needed perspective or encouragement. He'd continued his advocacy work, now with a deeper understanding of the systems that had failed him and countless others. He spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, and worked with organizations trying to reform foster care and adoption practices. Eleanor lived for 3 more years after Sarah's death. She passed away quietly in her sleep at Meadowbrook, in the same room where she and Sarah had spent their final years together. Michael called Maya with the news, and they cried together over the phone, grieving for the grandmother he'd known for such a short time, but who had made such a profound impact on his life. "She never stopped fighting for Sarah," Michael said. "Even at the end, even when her own health was failing, she was still advocating for reforms, still telling anyone who would listen about what happened to her daughter. She turned her guilt into action, and that's a kind of redemption." At Eleanor's funeral, Maya met distant relatives who'd heard about the family's story through the book and the articles. They thanked her for telling it, for making sure that Sarah and Eleanor weren't forgotten, that their suffering and survival meant something. And she met other families who'd been inspired by the story to search for their own lost relatives, who'd successfully reunited with children or parents or siblings they thought were gone forever. Each one had a story of their own, each one a testament to the power of persistence and truth. 5 years after Sarah's death, Maya won the Pulitzer Prize for her body of work on institutional abuse and family separation. In her acceptance speech, she talked about Sarah and Michael, about Eleanor's tireless searching, about the importance of bearing witness to suffering and celebrating survival. "The stories we tell matter," Maya said to the audience of journalists and editors. "They matter because they give voice to those who've been silenced, because they challenge systems that prefer to hide their failures, because they remind us that every statistic represents a human being with dignity and worth." Sarah Whitmore was not just a case number in an asylum's filing cabinet. She was a mother who loved her son, a daughter who was loved in return, a woman who refused to let institutional cruelty erase her truth. Her story, and the stories of so many others like her, deserve to be told. And we, as journalists, have a responsibility to tell them. The standing ovation lasted for 3 minutes. Maya stood at the podium, holding the award, thinking about the night she'd driven through the rain to Holloway State Hospital, chasing a story she'd barely understood. She thought about Sarah's face in that old photograph, about Michael's drawing of a mother and son holding hands, about Eleanor's tearful hope that her daughter might still be alive. And she thought about her own mother, who she'd never quite said goodbye to, who she'd been trying to honor in her own complicated way through all the stories she'd told. "I see you, Mom," Maya whispered to herself. "I hope I made you proud." Michael was in the audience that night. He'd flown to New York for the ceremony, wanting to be there to support Maya the way she'd supported him. Afterward, At the reception, he pulled her aside. "Sarah would have loved this," he said. "Not the award itself, but what it represents. The acknowledgement that her story mattered, that she mattered." "She did matter," Maya said. "She still does. Every time I speak about institutional reform, every time I meet another family that's been reunited, I think about her. About how her refusal to accept the lies they told her was an act of resistance, of survival, of love." "Have you thought about what's next?" Michael asked. "What story you'll chase after this?" Maya smiled. "Actually, I've been thinking about writing a different kind of story. A memoir, maybe. About my mother, about grief, about why I do this work. I think it's time I stopped running from my own story and started telling it." "I'd read that book," Michael said, "and I think your mother would be proud." They stayed at the reception until late, celebrating with colleagues and friends, talking about the future of journalism and advocacy and the ongoing work of reform. But eventually, Maya found herself standing alone on the balcony of the venue, looking out at the New York City skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She'd gone to Holloway looking for a story, and she'd found so much more. She'd found a mother's love that transcended time and trauma. She'd found a son's resilience in the face of abandonment and abuse. She'd found a grandmother's redemption through decades of searching and caring. And somewhere in the process of telling their story, she'd begun to understand her own. The work wasn't finished. There were still children separated from their families, still people institutionalized without proper care, still systems that prioritized efficiency over humanity. But Sarah's story had made a difference. The reforms it had inspired would help people. The families it had reunited would build new futures together. And the truth it had brought to light would never be buried again. Maya pulled out her phone and opened her photos, scrolling back to the images she'd taken at Holloway that rainy October night. Sarah's file, Michael's drawing, the words written on the walls. "His name is Michael. He is alive." A mother's testimony, carved into plaster and paint, proclaiming a truth that no one had believed. But the truth had won in the end. Love had won. And that was worth every sleepless night, every tear shed, every moment of doubt and exhaustion. Maya looked up at the stars, barely visible in the light-polluted sky, but there if you knew where to look, and made a promise to herself. She would keep telling these stories. She would keep bearing witness. She would keep fighting for truth and justice and the radical act of believing people when they told you who they were and what they'd suffered. Because that's what mattered. That's what her mother had taught her, even if she'd only understood it fully after her mother was gone. The work of healing, the work of justice, the work of love, it was all the same work. And it was work worth doing. Sarah Whitmore's story had been told. Her voice had been heard. Her son had come home. And in a small cemetery in Vermont, beneath autumn leaves and endless sky, a mother and her truth rested at last in peace. If this story moved you, please like and share it so others can learn about Sarah and Michael's journey. Let me know in the comments what aspect of this investigation affected you most. Subscribe for more stories that matter, stories of truth, justice, and the power of never giving up.